At the National Press Club, Yanis Varoufakis, author, academic economist and Greece's former finance minister. He now leads the European Realistic Disobedience Front. Yanis Varoufakis with today's National Press Club address.
Hello and welcome to today's National Press Club Westpac address, coming to you from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. My name is Anna Henderson. I'm the Chief Political Correspondent for SBS World News and a Director here at the club. Our guest today is Yanis Varoufakis, who has a pretty extraordinary resume. He's asked me to truncate it, but we have to step it out a little. Academic, economist, best-selling author, parliamentarian, political leader, Greece's former finance minister. He has spent time working as an academic in Australia and as finance minister was credited as the negotiator on the debt crisis with the European Union. His latest book is Techno-Feudalism, in which he contends that capitalism is dead. Today we will hear more about his concerns about the future of Europe and Australia and the fears of a slide into irrelevance because of ties with United States policy. You can follow the conversation at Press Club Ost or hashtag NPC. Please welcome Yanis Varoufakis.
Thank you very much. It is with a deep sense of obligation and duties to the custodians, to the owners of this land on which we're meeting, the Ngunnawal people, that I pay my respects to elders past, present and future, and in particular, and not just because last week we marked International Women's Day, I would like to mention the leading role of women, the women of the First Nations, as custodians of sophisticated and complex knowledge, as community organizers, and I think very importantly, as beacons of wisdom, especially for those of us who suffer from a masculine condition. Ladies and gentlemen, today I'm looking forward to discussing with you several thoughts, ideas and concerns with a view to reclaiming on behalf of Europe and Australia a shared future in a world which is changing, a world in which both Europe and Australia are becoming increasingly irrelevant. And to do so, I must add that, not merely as a European or Greek politician, but also a proud citizen of Australia. Europe and Australia are facing a common predicament, an existential threat, a creeping irrelevance which is due to two reasons. Firstly, we have invested far too little for far too long. And secondly, we have allowed ourselves to go along an ill-considered slide from strategic dependence on the United States to a non-strategic, self-defeating servility to Washington's agenda. Our present moment in Europe and Australia has been shaped by three different, important post-war phases. The first phase was the Bretton Woods system, from 1944 to 1971. America exited the Second World War as the only creditor country, the only surplus country. Bretton Woods was a remarkable recycling mechanism, and in effect a dollar zone that was founded on fixed exchange rates, sustained by capital controls, and directed on the back of America's gigantic, at the time, trade surplus. With quasi-free trade being part of the deal, Washington dollarized Europe, Japan, and Australia as part of a deal, the purpose of which was to create aggregate demand for all those products coming out of the production lines of the manufacturing sector of the United States, which had become so remarkably productive and efficient during the war economy. Subsequently, the United States trade surplus operated like a vacuum cleaner, hoovering out of our countries the dollars they had sent us through their net exports. The result was 20 years of high growth, low unemployment, low inflation, beautifully boring banking, dwindling inequality. But alas, that golden era of capitalism, the Bretton Woods system, was dead in the water the moment the United States slipped from being a surplus country to a country with a very large trade deficit. The second phase was marked by the violent reversal of this recycling mechanism. The United States became the first hegemon in the history of humanity that increased its hegemony by boosting its trade deficit, by going further into the red. Operating like another powerful vacuum cleaner, the burgeoning American trade deficit hoovered up the world's net exports. And how did America pay for these imports? With dollars, which it also hoovered up from the rest of the world, as German, Japanese, and later Chinese capitalists sent to Wall Street more than 70% of their profits for recycling in Wall Street in the form of treasuries, government debt, real estate, shares, and of course, later on, the infamous derivatives. This audacious inverted recycling system, founded on America's deficits, required ever-increasing American deficits in order to remain stable. In the process, it gave rise to growth rates even faster than those under the Bretton Woods system. However, it also gave rise to gigantic macroeconomic and financial imbalances, as well as mind-numbing levels of inequality. The new era came complete with an ideology, remember neoliberalism, with a policy of letting finance rip, financialization, and a false sense of dynamic equilibrium. Remember the Great Moderation, which was built, of course, on hugely immoderate imbalances. Almost inevitably, on the back of this perpetual tsunami of capital, rushing in from the rest of the world to Wall Street, financiers fashioned gargantuan pyramids of complex derivatives, what Warren Buffett referred to as weapons of mass financial destruction. They went off, and we had the GFC, the global financial crisis. Capitalism and Wall Street were saved by the G7 central banks that printed between April 2009 and last year. They printed all the G7 central banks together around 35 trillion American dollars. That was one reason capitalism was saved. The second was China. China directed half its national income to investment, and in so doing replaced a lot of the lost aggregate demand, not just domestically in China, but also in the United States, in Germany, and Australia. The third period, the third phase, is more recent. I call it the era of techno-feudalism, and that's the book that you kindly mentioned. I believe that this third era took root in the mid-2000s, but grew strongly after the GFC in conjunction with a rapid technological change that caused capital to mutate into a new form. I call it cloud capital. It's what lives inside your phone, inside your laptop. It's an automated means of behavioral modification. Consider the 6 things that cloud capital does. Where do you encounter it? When you go into Amazon.com, when you go into Uber. The 6 things that cloud capital does. It grabs our attention, first. It manufactures our desires. Third, it sells directly to us the things that will satiate the desires that it has manufactured. Fourth, it drives and monitors workers in the workplace, whether the workplace is a factory, an Amazon warehouse, or the cab of a truck in which a driver monitored by the same algorithm works. Fifth, it elicits massive free labor from all of us every time we click, we like, or we post whatever we do on the internet. And finally, it provides the potential for blending seamlessly all that with digital payments. Is it any wonder that the owners of this cloud capital, I call them cloudalists, is it any wonder that these cloudalists have hitherto undreamt of power? They are already a new ruling class. If you look at the capitalization of the 7 cloudalist firms in the United States, also known as the Magnificent Seven, you'll find that their capitalization of those 7 firms is larger than the capitalization of every listed company in the following countries: United Kingdom, France, Japan, Canada, and China taken together. Where did the money come for so much cloud capital to accumulate? Where did all this investment come from? Remember the $35 trillion that the G7 central banks produced after the GFC? That's where the money came. One example, 9 out of $10 invested by Zuckerberg in Facebook came from central bank money. So the issue, ladies and gentlemen, is not what will AI do to us in the future. The issue is what it has already done to us. And now a question of immense importance to Europe and to Australia. In which countries is cloud capital concentrated? In the United States and in China. Nowhere else. Hold that thought, I'll come back to it. First, let's say a few words about Europe. Most of you will know me as the failed finance minister of the most bankrupt state in Europe. Though I take solace that some people here in Canberra, including 1 or 2 government ministers, remember me as their Sydney University economics lecturer. In my defense, and lest we forget, the reason why I was elected to the finance ministry in 2015 was because we had a catastrophic, cataclysmic collapse, not just of Greece, but the whole of the Eurozone, the whole of the European Union's banking sector, and then a domino effect, with Greece being simply the canary in the mine. The reason why Europe was so severely damaged by the GFC was the ludicrous monetary architecture that we had erected. We had a monetary union that had a central bank without a treasury to have its back, and we had 19 treasuries without a central bank to have their back while they were trying to bail out 19 separate banking systems that were all bankrupt. In short, even if European governments wanted, after 2008, to emulate the sensible response to the GFC of the Rudd administration, of the Rudd government, we simply lacked the institutions to do it in Europe. And the result was the European doom loop between banking losses, stagnation, unpayable public and private debts, and an investment strike lasting a quarter of a century. The result of which today is Europe's, and in particular Germany's, deindustrialization. Quarter of a century later, whereas once, 25 years ago, we had a debilitating north-south divide in Europe, now we also have an east-west divide, in addition to the north-south divide. While the essential fiscal and political union that Europe needs is further away from the horizon than ever. The European Union's so-called Green Deal is honored in the breach, not in the implementation. Europe's industries are falling behind their competitors in the United States and China in every technological race that matters, particularly green technology and green energy. And our continent lacks cloud capital in the age of techno-feudalism, where power stems from owning copious amounts of cloud capital, the capital that only the United States and China possess. In my introduction, I said, controversially, I hope, that Europe and Australia are facing irrelevance and marginalization. 2 are the reasons. One, neither Europe nor Australia possess sufficient quantities of cloud capital. It's a bit like trying to make your way in the 19th century without steam engines and locomotives. And the second reason is the new Cold War, which is upending Europe's and Australia's business model. Speaking of the new Cold War, almost a year ago, in this prestigious institution, Paul Keating lambasted the Albanese government for making the wrong call in allowing Australia to become complicit in Washington's pursuit of that new Cold War, against Australia's interests. The one question that Paul Keating did not ask was, why is Washington doing this? What lies behind the new Cold War? Why did President Trump kickstart this confrontation with the banning of Huawei and ZTE and then the aluminium tariffs? And please don't say that that's what Trump does, because Joe Biden, who was supposed to be the anti-Trump, gets elected, and what does he do? He turbocharges that Cold War by declaring economic warfare against Beijing, because that is what you do when you say you are not going to be allowed to import advanced microchips. When I ask this question in the United States amongst my friends there, I get two answers as to the rationale behind the new Cold War. One is Taiwan. The escalating military threat to international trade by the Chinese government. Taiwan and escalation. I'm afraid I remain depressingly unconvinced. I wish I could have been convinced. Ever since Nixon went to China, and during the long period when Washington was strong-arming Australia, Europe, to accept China in the World Trade Organization, in the circuits of international capitalism, it was very clear that the one China policy was a given, that Chinese sovereignty over Taiwan was never contested by the West. So what has changed? As for China's military threat, I'm afraid that on this I'm with Malcolm Fraser when he opined once that we will only be able to talk about a provocation of the Chinese military when Chinese Navy ships anchored just outside the San Diego base of the US Navy in the United States or outside Norfolk, Virginia. And please, can someone explain to me the rationale behind the accusation that China is threatening international shipping routes when China is a country that depends entirely on a current account surplus and importing energy? Why would they ever want to jeopardize international shipping routes? No, ladies and gentlemen, the new Cold War is neither due to Taiwan nor to China. The answer lies, and this is my hypothesis, in cloud capital. America's hegemony since 1971 is built on its trade deficit, which is a paradox. And that, however, relies entirely on its capacity to maintain its monopoly over international dollar-denominated payments. That is what allows the United States to make the rest of the world pay for its deficits. But Chinese cloud capital has already achieved something that the dollar system has not achieved and cannot achieve. It has seamlessly integrated cloud capital with financial services. For example, take WeChat, an application that is provided by Chinese conglomerate Tencent. It allows you, or allows anyone who has a one account to make free payments anywhere. Free payments, independently of where they bank. That is not available in Australia, in Europe, in the United States. Similarly, the digital currency of the Central Bank of China. Why is there no American equivalent to this? It's really very simple. Because Wall Street will not allow it. Wall Street refuses to share financial rents either with the West Coast Silicon Valley cloud elites or with the Federal Reserve. And there's the rub. America still maintains its dominance over international payments, payments that are traveling along a rickety dollar highway full of potholes and technological backwardness, which nevertheless remains the highway of choice for global money. Meanwhile, Chinese cloud capital has constructed an all-singing, all-dancing payment superhighway, denominated in one, that very few use. But this superhighway's very existence is a clear and present danger to the American monopoly of the dollar payment system on which America's hegemony rests, especially after the war in Ukraine created jitters amongst oligarchs from Saudi Arabia to Indonesia to the Philippines, and some in Europe as well, who started using that superhighway, fearing that their monies may be confiscated at some point. In short, the new Cold War has nothing to do with trade routes, Taiwan, or Chinese escalation. It is rather the manifestation of a dangerous clash between two techno-feudal systems, one denominated in dollars, the other in Chinese yuan. So, if I'm right, the question becomes, what should Australia do in this topsy-turvy world, which is increasingly techno-feudal? At the domestic front, first, we, and I say we, because I am the proud carrier of an Australian passport, as I said, the first thing we must do is we must ditch the old rentier business model of banking on holes and homes, because this old model of Australia is now a Ponzi scheme. A Ponzi scheme whose maintenance will result in a country marred by minimal investment in the things that matter, low productivity, debilitating inequality, high inflation, and low wages, pushing the talented people of this country, especially the young, into a low innovation sinkhole. Instead, we should adopt in this country a Green New Deal for Australia as a necessity, not as a luxury. Let me give you an example. Europe is about to introduce a border adjustment carbon tax. America surely will follow. So will others. So Australia must end its dependence on dirty fossil fuels and unrefined minerals and let rip on solar power and wind, but primarily solar. To do what with it? To produce green hydrogen. To do what with it? Not to export it, but to use it domestically in a new manufacturing sector, intermediate manufacturing sector, that refines copper, cobalt, nickel into green copper, green cobalt, green steel, and then transport it and export it to Asia, where the batteries will be manufactured, that will go into the electric vehicles that will be sold to Europe and to the rest of the world as green technology. That, I think, is the future for an Australia that participates in the international division of green labour. But for that to happen, this country needs a massive injection of public investment. The private sector will not do it. Nothing short of a latter-day 1950s snowy scheme is necessary here. Second, acknowledge that it has never been more dismal to be young in this country. Reverse the absurdity of the Australian government collecting more money from HECS than it does from the Petroleum Resource Rent Tax. Tax rents properly to make higher education free again. And negative gearing, and in particular, the egregious, inane capital gains exemption over real estate investments. Tax those with concentrated power to set prices, and tax them through the nose. And move away from the mentality of tax cuts as something which is clever and good. It is neither clever nor good. You care about the youth? Build social housing. Because social housing has a twin effect. Firstly, it benefits those who take it. Secondly, by increasing supply, it reduces or caps the inflation in the prices of private homes. So everybody benefits. That's the second thing I would do. The third, since Australian capitals cannot compete with the big tech, the capitalists of the west coast of the United States or of China, it is the role of the Australian government, in the same way that it once created the ABC or CSIRO, it is the role of the Australian government to put at the disposal of Australians important new technologies, to build up public cloud capital, beginning with a digital Australian dollar that the Reserve Bank of Australia can provide tomorrow. Essentially, a free checking account for every resident of this country, based on your tax file number with a PIN number. Receiving on your deposits there the interest rate provided by the Reserve Bank of Australia to those who already have accounts with them, the bankers, at the overnight rate. What about internationally? First, Australia must restore a reputation tainted by blindly following America into lethal adventures in Iraq and Afghanistan. And today, via its active and crucial complicity in Israel's deliberate war crimes in Gaza, East Jerusalem, and the West Bank. Ladies and gentlemen, children are not starving in Gaza today. No, they are being deliberately starved, without hesitation and without remorse. The famine in Gaza is not collateral damage. It is intentional policy, the purpose of which is to defeat a population and ultimately to root them out of that land. By lending credence to the notion that Israel is exercising the right to self-defense, and by defunding on the basis of unsubstantiated allegations, the only agency that can ameliorate the starvation in Gaza, Australia damaged its already wounded reputation. Reversing this decision is too little too late now. Just as there was a bipartisan campaign led by Malcolm Fraser and Bob Hawke to end South African apartheid against the wishes of Washington that supported the white supremacists in Pretoria, the Australian political class needs to lead a campaign to end apartheid in Israel-Palestine and to restore equal civil liberties to Israelis and to Palestinians. This is the duty of every nation, but it is especially the duty of this one. Why? Because of the sorry history of terra nullius, the white settlers' ideological cover for the genocide of the native populations, which was transported from British outposts like Australia to the land of Palestine and Israel, with the banner, a land without a people for a people without a land. That's terra nullius. Second, Australia has a duty to de-escalate the new Cold War. I've already made this point, but I need to make it once more. To understand that this can only be done if Australia ends its servility to the United States, a United States that is actively creating threats that then makes us pay through the nose to be protected from. Imagine an Australia that helps bring a just peace in Ukraine, as opposed to a mindless forever war that is going nowhere. A non-aligned Australia that is never neutral in the face of injustice, but also not automatically aligned with every warmongering adventure decided by its allies. Imagine an Australia which having re-established its credentials as a country that thinks and acts on its own behalf, engages with China in a spirit of peaceful cooperation, a far better way of addressing Beijing's increasing authoritarianism towards its own people than buying useless, hyper-expensive submarines that only succeed in forcing China's political class to close ranks around an authoritarian core. Imagine a truly patriotic Australian Prime Minister who tells the American president to cease and desist from the slow murder of my friend Julian Assange. For what? For the crime of journalism. For exposing to American citizens the crimes that their government and our governments have perpetrated behind our backs in our name. In the end, that will make for a better friendship with the United States, because, believe you me, one of the few things I've learned while I was in office, that short period of time, American power brokers appreciate you more if you can say no to them. They would appreciate an independently minded Australia more than they appreciate today's Australia. In the same way you appreciate a friend who tells you you're wrong when you're wrong, rather than say yes to everything you do and then whinge behind your back. To conclude, if Europe and Australia are to escape gross irrelevance, we need separate but well-coordinated Green New Deals, one for Europe and one for Australia. But none of that is going to work. In a world buffeted by an uncontrollable new Cold War that threatens the green transition, which is necessary to preserve the viability of our species. To have a future, Europe and Australia must end our mindless slide from strategic dependence on the United States to improvised, impulsive, inexpedient servility to the United States. DiEM25, our pan-European movement, is working towards this goal, especially now in view of the European Parliament elections in the coming June. In the last fortnight, while I was here in Australia, during this visit, I was thrilled to discover many talented Australians full of wonderful ideas of how to do this in this country, as well as effective organizations dedicated to the same cause. Optimism is perhaps not yet empirically founded, but hope burns brightly. Thank you.
Thank you for your address. I think one of the main issues that you've taken up in your conversation here is around how Australia is aligning itself with the United States on a military level. Just in the last week, our Foreign Minister Penny Wong was again warning of destabilising, provocative and coercive action by China. Is there a risk that you're actually blind to the defence reality in the region in how you're framing this debate? And what do you say to those who see your position as quite naive on this because of the realities of different defence superpowers and their military build-up and the economics behind that?
Was there a Chinese vessel entering territorial waters in Australia, in Japan, in the United States? None of that. So the only risk here is that we will allow somebody like the foreign minister to get away with subterfuge, and by creating a false perspective on a threat which is not there. The Chinese people have every reason to fear their government. If you are a student at the Hong Kong Polytechnic, you are terrorized by a very authoritarian regime. If you're a Muslim, you have difficulties in particular provinces, as we very well know in China. My friends and comrades in China feel that there is an increasing authoritarian noose around their neck. That is a threat, and we need to help Chinese Democrats and Chinese progressives and some Chinese socialists. We need to help them liberate themselves from that noose. But we are not going to do it by allowing Penny Wong and other warmongers to create a false sense that China is threatening Australia when that is not the case, in order to weaponize a particular defensive military-industrial complex motivated policy, which in the end is the best gift you can make to the elements of the Chinese Communist Party who use this clear representation of the situation in the Pacific in order to clamp down on their own people.
Our next question is from Tom Connell.
Tom Connell on the board here and also from Sky News. Thank you for your speech. I want to go back to 2015 when President Xi Jinping was in the White House with Obama and he pledged not to militarise the South China Sea, the islands there. He then went and did that. Isn't that a threat that emanated from the Chinese side, a change in what they said they'd do that needed to be responded to? In a similar way, China's made no secret of wanting bases that happen to be close to Australia in the Pacific. Aren't they real risks and threats that do need responding to? Debate how you do it, but they do need responding to?
Whenever in the diplomatic sphere there is backtracking, there has to be a diplomatic language for responding to it, and sometimes some action when in terms of some military maneuvers that are proportional to the threat. But allow me to pose the question slightly differently. What happened with Europe and NATO's expansion after all the successive pledges that there would be no expansion of NATO? Pledges to Yeltsin, to Putin, which were completely and utterly violated by the West. Does that justify Putin's weaponization of this particular violation of pledges in order, in the end, even to invade Ukraine? I don't think so. So, proportional responses, yes. Do I have a problem with militarization? I do. Do I believe that the answer to the militarization of particular islands in the South China Seas is essentially to turbocharge a new Cold War that destroys our business model and which essentially, the only thing it does, it solidifies the power base of the particular segment of the Communist Party in Beijing, which you consider to be the source of the violation of that trust? I don't believe so. In other words, let's keep our heads. Let's maintain diplomatic proportionality. And certainly, let's not have $368 billion spent on submarines, which are completely useless to Australia, that will do nothing to ameliorate those threats that you're talking about, and which the seller to Australia has a button that can press and suddenly, like a Tesla car, can be switched off by Elon Musk at will. You are not going to be able to use your submarines for the purposes of Australia's defensive moves.
Our next question comes from Julie Hare.
Julie Hare from the Australian Financial Review. Thank you so much for your speech. You speak about the new cloud capital, cloud capitalism, I don't know, and the new ruling class. You talk about the GFC being a pivotal point in the development of that. Could you please explain to us how the GFC played the role in the development of this new capital?
It paid for it. The GFC caused our great and good leaders to congregate in London in April 2009 in a state of panic, naturally, because the whole system was going pear-shaped. And they decided to refloat finance. Between that April of 2009, under the chairmanship of Gordon Brown, if you remember, who was Prime Minister of Britain at the time, till last year, they printed $35 trillion. Now, at the same time, they were practicing austerity in Europe, in Britain, even in the United States, despite Obama's alleged stimulus program. What happens when you pump huge quantities of freshly minted monies into the financial system? It's full of liquidity, it's drowning in liquidity, and you have austerity in the real economy. What happens is the Bank of America or Deutsche Bank or Citigroup, they pick up the phone, they call an industrialist, British Aerospace or General Electric, and say, I've got 500 million, I'll give it to you for free, 0 interest rate. Will you take it? Now, if you're GE, right, you look around and you see no demand for your products. You already have cash, which you are too scared to invest. But you still get it for zero interest rate. You say, yes, give it to me. But you don't invest it. What you do is you go to the stock exchange and you buy back your own shares. The share price goes up, your bonus goes up, no investment. The only firms that actually invested in capital were the cloudalists, the Zuckerbergs, and the Googles, and so on and so forth. This is why I'm saying, this is my hypothesis, or thesis if you want, that our central banks paid for the explosion in the quantity and therefore the quality in the final analysis of cloud capital.
What would have happened if austerity, if they'd gone towards austerity as opposed to what you're describing here?
Well, let's say that they, instead of giving it to the bankers, the central banks were to go in association with a public investment bank to put money into green tech. Well, in Europe, we wouldn't be dependent on Putin's Gazprom the way we were once he invaded Ukraine. We would have had good quality jobs, same in the United States. We wouldn't have had Trump. We wouldn't have had the Alternative for Deutschland, because all these neo-fascists, this is what I call them, right? Because I'm too old and tired to try to find polite terms. All these neo-fascists grew up because they surfed the wave of discontent caused by the combination of socialism for the bankers and austerity for everyone else.
Thank you.
Paul Karp.
Paul Karp from The Guardian. Thanks very much for your speech. Many of your domestic policy solutions, like a Green New Deal or cutting housing tax concessions, would be good for the environment and good for inequality, but I can't see how they would do anything to prevent this techno-feudalism, the problem that you've described in your speech. Could I please ask, firstly, what do you think of more extreme policy solutions like the US breaking up big tech companies or Australia banning tech companies from collecting users' data? And secondly, do you think consumers would be keen to sign up to a government bank account, a government Uber and a government Amazon as a publicly owned alternative?
Firstly, I did mention the importance of, for instance, the government, in the same way that they created CSIRO and the ABC, to create a public cloud capital infrastructure which can be used either at the level of the state, for instance, the Reserve Bank providing you. Why don't you answer your own question? If the Reserve Bank of Australia gave you a digital wallet with a PIN number, and you could put your salary in there and make free payments to anyone, free payments, no fees, no questions asked, and you were to receive on your deposits the overnight interest rate of the Reserve Bank of Australia, would you say no to that?
I can see how a public option
you wouldn't say no to that. You would not say no to that.
Wouldn't the cloudalists still be hoovering up all my data?
No. Hang on. This is public. This is a public ledger, and you can have your Australian Parliament safeguard the anonymity of your payments and safeguard your privacy a lot better than the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. The NAB, of course, Westpac is excluded today. As for a government Uber, I wouldn't want a government Uber. It would be ludicrous to have a government Uber. But it would be brilliant if we had a cooperative of drivers with their own cloud capital, their own algorithm, so that they would retain the rents and the proceeds from their customers, rather than having them being skimmed off via Luxembourg, that's how Uber works, Ireland, to the Cayman Islands, right? So I'm talking about a cooperative enterprise here that is assisted through legislation by the Australian Parliament. Finally, I agree with you entirely that we need a digital Bill of Rights so that we own our data, and more so than our data, it is high time that we own our digital identity. Because you and I have no way of proving who we are on the internet unless we beg some conglomerate or bank to vouch for who we are. Because unlike the analog world, where, our states provide us with a driver's license or a passport, which proves who we are, and the internet, they don't. You have to beg Google to testify to who you are. So these small changes can make a very big difference.
Our next question is from Balad Al-Kaki.
So just here for the Australian Associated Press. You've included some suggestions about potential business models or technologies that can be useful, including a public cloud capital to counteract the concentration of power among tech giants. What hope can this give for small business owners in a cost of living crisis?
Well, to begin with, the cost of living crisis here is a double-edged sword, because companies like Amazon or Walmart in the United States have an ideology of cheapness. But that cheapness, in the end, bites us on the backside, because that cheapness means that all the value that is created by companies producing the stuff that is sold on their platforms is skimmed off from the producers and is siphoned off into the account of Jeff Bezos. And from there, it doesn't go anywhere, because if you have $200, $300 billion, I mean, if I give you another dollar, how can you spend it? You can't spend it even if you want to, right? So putting the lid on what Amazon can do is, in the end, through secondary and tertiary effects, in the interests of the whole of the economy, including small businesses. But I would, as a first step, recommend, for instance, to the Australian government that it does what the Indonesian government does. Other governments, Turkey, slap a 5% cloud tax on digital purchases. Really very simple. You tax the purchase, which is detrimental to the possibility that a small shop can trade without effectively trading through a platform that will skim off whatever value it produces. And if you want to take this further, if you feel radical enough, you can say to these platforms that if you want to trade in this country, you're going to have to deposit 10% of your shares in our sovereign wealth fund, where the dividends accumulate and they are distributed to the people of Australia as a basic income, or basic dividend, to be more precise.
Thank you.
Our next question comes from Simon Gross.
Simon Gross, Canberra IQ. Cloud capitalism. You're basically talking about the digitalisation of so much of what we do in commerce and in dealing with government. And you're seeing average citizens as victims. I just want to relate this to Greece. When you had the big financial problem, one of the things we got to learn was the high level of tax evasion and tax avoidance that is like a national sport in Greece. Last month, the IMF came out with this report about recent trends of informality in Greece. Mm-hmm. That's the term they use for the tax avoidance evasion. And they say that the digitalisation is a major factor that helped reduce informality in Greece. So can you just extemporise a bit about
Sure.
the goods and the bads of this, the digitalisation of our lives?
I'm all for digitalisation. I love technology. I'm not a Luddite or neo-Luddite. I don't want to smash the machines and go back to a bucolic lifestyle. As a finance minister, it was my intention effectively to ban cash, to make all transactions digital in order to do away with the problem of tax evasion. That wasn't very appreciated by the vast majority of tax evaders. But you see, the point I want to make, if I may, is this. My concept of cloud capital is not a critique of digitalization. It is a critique of the fact that we have particular companies that own so much cloud capital that can modify our behavior in such a way as to allow the owners of that digital capital or cloud capital to amass rents, which is another form of hypersonic tax evasion or evasion of everything. Because think, Amazon pays no tax. You realize that? Zero.
Yeah, it's
Zero.
It's
Zero.
very dodgy stuff, yes.
Zero. Okay? Zero. It's all legal. Zero.
They'd probably say something different, but they'd probably be...
Of course they would say something different.
Like it wouldn't be as much as they should.
I only need to state that they pay zero tax.
Okay.
Last year, I looked at the numbers. They had 46 billion euros, 46 billion euros revenues in Europe, and they paid zero. Yeah. Okay? Now, whatever you tell me, I'm not convinced that they had no profits. Okay? And they paid zero.
Okay.
So, digitalization is not a solution to tax evasion when the whole value chain is being taken to the Cayman Islands by Jeff Bezos. So, yes to digitalization, but at the same time, we need to take over the ownership of these chunks of cloud capital that allows them to create a series of different problems,
So
not just the
over.
tax evasion.
You say take over, what do you mean?
Well, for instance, I gave the example before of how an alternative Uber could operate. A cooperative which belongs to the workers, to the drivers, and they have the algorithm. It is part of the capital of the cooperative, and then you have digitization of the taxi service, but it doesn't go to the Cayman Islands. It does not create circumstances of psychological despair amongst the drivers, and it doesn't exploit your data the way that Uber does. That's an example. Socialization of the algorithm, not nationalization.
Okay.
Tony Melville.
Tony Melville, Director of the National Press Club. I wasn't going to talk about tax evasion, but one of my favourite, maybe apocryphal Greek stories was when a tax was introduced on swimming pools, there was a huge sale of tarpaulins as people covered up their backyards. It could be apocryphal. But my question goes back to your comment about being the, and I quote you, the failed finance minister, former finance minister of the most bankrupt state in Europe.
Yep.
There's quite a big Greek community here today, and how about something positive about Greece in terms of how the economy is going there?
I'm not going to indulge in fantasy. Okay, you want something positive?
Yeah.
I'll say it in Greek and then I'll translate. Η Ελλάδα ποτέ δεν πεθαίνει. That is, I'll translate. Greece cannot be killed. It's very hard to kill. Right?
Nick Stewart.
Most of the people here today have paid for their lunches using credit cards. Everyone is using credit cards all the time. As you pointed out, the Reserve Bank of Australia has actually looked at and investigated, although we haven't seen any results of their investigation, they've looked at the possibility of introducing some alternative form of transaction. At the moment, between 1% and 3% of all Australia's GDP is effectively going overseas to a number of multinationals. Yeah. What can we do now? Why
vote for politicians who have what it takes to introduce it?
What if you can't find any?
Well, then you run. Then you create them. No, but seriously. In China today, whatever you may think about China and the United States and all that, as we speak, there are 180 million digital wallets that already are running, and they are not just used by Chinese. I know German entrepreneurs who use them because they buy aluminium from Shenzhen, they bring it to Germany, they make propellers for the shipyards in Shanghai, and then they send the propellers to Shanghai. Instead of going to their bank managers in Deutsche Bank to send money to the Bundesbank, that goes to the European Central Bank, that goes to the Central Bank of China, that then goes to their private account and makes a payment to get the aluminium, and then the whole process being reversed, They have a digital wallet provided by the Central Bank of China. They make the payment by just pressing one button, no fees, no questions asked. The money goes backwards and forwards. Why can the Chinese do this and we can't? It's not that the Reserve Bank of Australia can't do it or they have to look into it again and again. They can do it yesterday. The banks won't let them because they demand the monopoly of the payment system. And that is a scandal that they have it. Because, you know, if you ask an economics student, what is the role of a bank? They say, oh, they're intermediaries. They take deposits from Jill and they lend them to Jack. That's not what they do. That is a fiction. What they do is because in order to make a payment to have your lunch or to get a coffee from a coffee shop, you need to have a private account. Otherwise, there's no card. Well, if the Reserve Bank gave them that card, then suddenly the banks would have to provide genuine services to their customers, something they do not want to do. Except Westpac, of course.
Do you think Australian consumers would prefer to have that and actually reduce their fees rather than the Qantas points or other things like that?
Well, to the extent that Australian consumers are not totally idiotic, yes.
We've got a few more questions to go. I just wanted to take you to one part of your address where you did speak about Australia, in your view, blindly following the US. And
in my view, okay.
And in terms of the way that you've raised that concern around the pausing of funding in Gaza, we do seek a variety of perspectives here at the Press Club, of course, to hear different sides of, you know, the viewpoints on these issues. Is it not important that countries like Australia and the many other countries who have also taken pause on that funding to investigate when those kinds of issues are raised? Of
course, investigate to your heart's content. But don't stop feeding the starving while you're investigating. You would never have done that in any other part of the world. Of course, everything needs to be investigated, but you know what? We're missing the point. The point is that as we speak, there are people who are bombed and people who are starved, and Australia is whistling in the wind. And that is not good for Australia's image in the whole wide world, in the global south, but also in the global north, amongst the youngsters who in 10 years' time will be the decision makers and who, even in the United States, are appalled by this complicity in so much suffering.
Tom Connell again. I won't thank you for your speech again. I might just thank you for inspiring the magnificent lamb lunch, which was really good. You've spoken about the power of big tech. Roosevelt, once upon a time, broke up big oil and big railway because they were bad for the country. Maybe big tech is still bad for the US, but they bring in so much money. It's such a part of the share market. Probably not. China, a similar thing. So if they don't want it to happen, how would that play out if the rest of the world and countries sort of combine to try to bring or hobble big tech while the US and China want those companies to be as big as they are? Is that going to be a problem?
Of course it's going to be a problem. Whenever you are faced with exorbitant power, you have an exorbitant problem. There's no doubt about that. What I'm saying is that we need to try it. But look, it is a mistake to think of the task at hand in the same way that we thought in the 1910s about trust busting. You know, Theodore Roosevelt famously and very courageously broke up Standard Oil, Rockefeller's monopoly. That was very difficult politically, but technically dead easy. Because there you had an oil company, petrol company, having all these petrol stations across the United States. It was one thing, one monolithic company, and what the government did was to say, okay, fine, we break it down to 50 companies, one per state. It's quite straightforward to do. You can't do this with Google. The whole point about Google is that it is universal. That you, that you search. How do you break up? You take YouTube away from the Google search engine, the whole thing collapses. So I don't believe that the solution will come by emulating that which happened in the 1910s. We need a completely different approach. I think there are 3 steps or 4 steps that I would recommend, or a number of, there are lots of things you can do, but it's not the old-fashioned regulation. The first thing you need to do is impose interoperability. That is, at the moment, if you want to get out of Elon Musk's X, or Twitter, as we mostly know it, you can't. You can't. There's Blue Sky, there are many alternatives, and technically, technologically, they are just as good or better. But I have 1 million followers on Twitter. If I leave and go to Blue Sky, I will not have even myself as my follower.
It's a good problem to have. It's a good problem to have.
It's a good problem to have, maybe. Not if you want to, to speak your mind, right? Seriously now. No, but imagine if you could actually take your followers with you, which is what the telephone companies, remember, you're too young to remember, a long time ago, you could not take your telephone number, your mobile number, from Telstra to Optus, right? Until the government said, no, you can't. Now, that is technically very easy, to allow the transfer of a telephone number. To allow all your data that you have on Facebook to go somewhere else is another matter. So you can do that. You can have a digital bill of rights, so that if they use your data, they will have to pay you. Pennies, but pay you. Thirdly, what I said about the Sovereign Wealth Fund. Deposit shares there, and therefore give the people of Australia, the Australian Parliament, a say in the meetings of the shareholders. These are more radical, but I think smarter approaches. When it comes to the algorithms, you need to have, in the same way you have, the federal police, you can create a federal unit, the purpose of which is to work out subterfuge and illegality that has been implanted into algorithms. For instance, let me give you an example, right? When you are a publisher, a newspaper, or whatever, a vendor in Amazon.com, at first they lure you in by elevating you quite up there, and so you see a lot of trade. They bring you in, you do a lot and more and more trade on Amazon because you're making money. The moment they have caught you, right, they push you down. And then they blackmail you, and they say you have to pay us this amount of your revenue if you're going to be elevated again. That should be illegal. And there should be a way of simply taking these people to the cleaners.
Thank you. I understand that techno-feudalism is a global phenomenon, but I'm wondering if there's a natural system of politics or government to accompany techno-feudalism. And just secondly, do you believe social democracy can survive the challenge of the rise of the far-right parties, particularly in Europe?
Well, it is a global phenomenon, just like capitalism was a global phenomenon. But that doesn't mean that it is the same everywhere. Like capitalism was not the same everywhere. Chile, Sweden, Australia, Poland, they're all capitalist countries, but very different within capitalism. Similarly, techno-feudalism in China is different to techno-feudalism in America. And one difference is the fact that I made the point about payment systems, which in China are far more efficient because the financiers do not control what the big tech does in China. The second point was?
The second question was actually
about social democracy.
Social democracy and the rise of right.
Look, I have a very sad view about this, very depressing view. I think social democracy died a long time ago and we didn't notice it. What do I mean by that? What was social democracy? It was the political project of governments bringing together the representatives of industrial capital, of the factories, and the trade unions, and cutting a deal between them, saying to the factory owners, okay, you'll have industrial peace, we will be off your case, but a chunk of your profits, of your surplus value, will go to the state to fund Medicare, another chunk will go to workers for them to have a decent life. Okay? But after the end of Bretton Woods, we had a situation where the economic sphere split up, divided and multiplied between the industrial sphere and the financial sphere. So finance effectively broke off, created its own realm. And power moved from the industrial manufacturing sector to the banking sector. Once that happened, and especially with deindustrialization everywhere, in the United States, in Britain, here. All the factories went. Even if you're the Australian Prime Minister or the British Prime Minister or the American President, who do you bring around the table? The head of Goldman Sachs and the trades union, of nurses? What conversation can you have at that point? That's why I'm saying that, and the reason why you see the waning of social democracy, the diminishing of the ambition of the ALP, where effectively the ALP said, okay, look, we'll get out of this. No awards, no collective bargaining agreements. We'll just introduce minimum wage and look after workers through the pension system or superannuation. That's the end of social democracy. This idea of a kind of grand bargain, a great contract between capital and labour has gone a long time ago. And the GFC killed it off completely. And now techno-feudalism has made it a figment of our imagination.
I don't know whether to thank you for that or not, but anyway, thank you.
Look, we'd just like to thank you very much for your time today. Effaristov.
Parakalo.
And give you a warm thank you from the group.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoy our videos, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell button to get notified when we publish a new one. See you next time.
I'm over-rotting.
So what you're using Voxy Mobile's unlimited social media from £10 for now?
Being sociable?
Boring. Wanna see what your ex is up to?
With unlimited social media, the fun never ends on Voxy Mobile. Selected social apps in UK, TNCs apply.
New Domino's cookies, stuffed with a whole Cadbury cream egg.
I could see Wolfgang Schäuble, the German finance minister. He was looking at me with, eyes that felt like laser beams. And he gets the floor and he said, one sentence, which is the one that I'm going to leave you with. Elections cannot be allowed to change economic policy. Got it? My response was, this is excellent news to the Chinese Communist Party because they believe that too. And I then came up with a proposal. This is why they hated me. I was very moderate and said, in that case, Wolfgang, let's ban elections in bankrupt countries. Let's come out and declare that in the European Union, you can only have democracy if you're a creditor country. If you're a debtor country, no democracy, elections cannot be allowed to change anything. Because we have a loan agreement. We have a debtor's prison. Let's put Greece in the workhouse. I didn't say all these things, but I did say the thing about the Chinese Communist Party.
And I quote from his preface, "I've always believed that if you're not able to explain the economy in a language which young people can understand, then you're clueless yourself." This from its author, Yanis Varoufakis, a man not only known not to mince his words, but one who in fact wrote the book in Greek in 9 days. I'm Mary Stack, the director of Cambridge Forum, and tonight to assist us in navigating the murky waters of capitalism, and to quote Yanis, come to terms with the beast that dominates our lives, we are privileged to have the best of teachers, a philosopher and international economist, Yanis Varoufakis.
And I'm very much looking forward to the conversation that we're going to have. But I've been asked to give a presentation, so I will, because sometimes I like to do as I'm told, not very often. The title that has been advertised, and some of you saw it outside and walked in, so I might as well honor the title, is a question. Is capitalism devouring democracy? Allow me to begin with a slightly different question. Have you noticed how in the last few decades the quality of politicians has tumbled? Not just in this country, everywhere. For God's sakes, even I became a politician in 2015. No, but seriously, there is a marked diminution in the rhetoric, in the capacity of politicians to inspire, and indeed, in the power that they have. Now, I don't believe that this is due to a degeneration of the DNA of humanity or of those who are interested in politics. What we have been observing is the shrinking of what I shall refer to as the political sphere. There used to be a time, before capitalism, when there was one sphere, the sphere of power. It was impossible to separate economic power from political power. The king had He had military power produced political power, and political power and economic power were one and the same thing. There is no great mystery, really, as to why there was no economics 150 years ago. Think about it. Harvard University did not have an economics department in the 19th century. Why? Because there was no need for it before capitalism came of age. Before capitalism, the political and the economic sphere were one. It was only with the enclosures in Britain that you had a remarkable transformation of society, that great transformation. The shifting from feudalism to capitalism. Effectively, the peasants were evicted from the land, replaced by sheep, because of the international trade routes that were creating an international market for wool, and some commodities like wool, like steel, like spices and so on, were emerging as international commodities with prices that were determined at the level of the international trade route system. And all the other commodities were goods, were effectively sidelined. So the lord of the land in Yorkshire or in Manchester had absolutely no incentive to retain those peasants planting idiotic little, vegetables, when they could just chuck them out of the land, replace them with fat sheep, whose wool suddenly had an international value, exchange value. But the enclosures created the working class. It created the commodification of labor. Up until then, people worked very hard, but they didn't sell their labor. We had a very interesting reversal of the timing of economic production and distribution. Under feudalism, we had work, production first. People actually toiled, they worked the land, and they produced the harvest. Production came first. Then came distribution. The lord of the land, or the manor or whatever, would send the sheriff in and take his cut from the harvest. How much he would take and how much he would leave behind was a political issue. It had to do with military power. It had to do even with the benevolence of the Lord. It had to do with the extent to which the Lord needed to keep the peasants on side in case another lord tried to usurp his property rights over the land. It was a political, diplomatic, ethical, religious, economic process that determined distribution after production. And then finally, the surplus that the lord amassed was sold in nearby markets, and that created a financial surplus for the lord, which then he lent out. So we had production, distribution, and then finally, finance. But with the enclosures and the eviction of the peasantry, we had the exact opposite. Because suddenly, the last thing that lords wanted to do is to work or to be entrepreneurial. So the replacement of the peasants with the sheep meant that suddenly every acre of land had an economic value, an exchange value, a price that did not exist. That was not the case before. Why did it acquire this price? Because you knew how many sheep you could raise on an acre. You know how much, more or less, wool you would produce. International markets were providing the equilibrium price of the wool, so you knew how much exchange value, money, you could gather per acre of your land. And of course, then, once that price was established, that exchange value per acre was established, suddenly land became a commodity, to be rented out, to be sold, to be purchased. There was no real estate market before that. Land was either you inherited land, in which case you had it, and if you never inherited land, you never got it. And the only way of effectively getting land that you didn't have was through war, through conquest. Or if the king decided to grant you a plot of land. There was no such thing as a market for land. And there was no such thing as a market of labor. The enclosures, the eviction of the peasants created land as a commodity and, of course, labor as a commodity, because the evicted peasants, effectively, they were roaming around the country, knocking on doors saying, I will do anything for work, for a piece of bread. That's the first labor market. That had never happened before in the history of humanity. People with nothing selling their labor time. That's the beginning of capitalism. But with this, you have the separation of the economic from the political sphere for the first time in our history as a species. Because suddenly you had merchants who acquired huge power through the accumulation of financial surpluses. Because the internationalization of those trade routes, the emergence of these few commodities as international commodities that bestowed substantial financial surplus upon those who handled them, whether they were the merchants, the ship owners, or the lords of the land, whose land now was used in order to cultivate, in inverted commas, wool. For the first time, you had this separation. You had lords whose political power and social power was now becoming increasingly disproportional to their economic power. You had those dirty merchants, as they consider them, the riffraff, the ugly, dirty merchants, acquiring huge quantities of economic power that had nothing to do with their social status. They were not allowed in the palace, they were not allowed in parliament, they were not allowed in the gentlemen's clubs in London, and suddenly they had a lot more economic power than the lords. So the economic and the political sphere separated. And with industrialization, you throw into this mix James Watt's great invention, the steam engine, and this process just goes berserk. And you have globalization, which Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in the Manifesto described in the most poetic language when they say that capital must nestle everywhere, it must settle everywhere, it must enter into relations everywhere. And it was interesting because when Marx and Engels were writing that, it hadn't happened yet. But they foresaw the process that we live in, globalization. And with globalization now, we have, well, with this process of globalization, you have the establishment of these completely separate two spheres. Now, interestingly, in the 19th century, you will recall this. Well, you live in a very historic town. Liberalism was a philosophy, a political philosophy, at odds with democracy. To be a liberal, a genuine liberal, you must have been very skeptical about democracy, if not completely and utterly anti-democratic. The whole point about liberalism was how to preserve the right to track, barter, and exchange, in Adam Smith's famous expression, which was a right that many of the liberals, including John Stuart Mill, a very liberal person, a very progressive person for his age, he considered the idea of democracy. What is democracy? It's the rule of the many, to be a great impediment, if not a great threat, to liberalism. So this, when we talk about liberal democracy today, we're talking about something that in the 19th century was a contradiction in terms. To be a liberal meant that you did not believe in democracy. Yeah? Now, what was it that brought about a change, a transformation? Suddenly, liberals started embracing the idea of democracy. It was economic crisis, financial and economic crisis, beginning especially in this country, but also in Europe in the 1840s. Because the moment capitalism started turbocharging itself with the creation of what I will describe as networked companies, with the advances in electromagnetism, with, electric engines, the telegraph, all the communication technology, electricity grids. When electricity comes into production and we move beyond steam, that's the second industrial revolution. to create, when Edison created his empire, he created a networked company. Remember, from the electric bulb to the power generating station, to the grid, everything was part of this. We talk about Google now and Apple as being mega companies. Well, the mega company was invented with the second industrial revolution. But think about it. To set up a company like Edison's, or later Henry Ford's, and so on, you needed a lot of financing. You needed a lot of money. So suddenly, the new reversed order becomes very significant, because now, ever since the peasants were thrown out of the land, ever since the enclosures in Britain, the Lord rented out, or leased out, an acre or a few acres to an ex-peasant and said, okay, I will charge you rent, you raise the sheep here, and you keep the difference, the residual payments. So once you pay for the land, me, once you pay the workers, the ones that have been expelled and now are working for a piece of bread, subsistence wages, once you pay for the sheep, for the shearing scissors, whatever it is that you're using, your capital equipment, what you keep in the end is yours, is your profit. So suddenly these proto-entrepreneurs were forced, they didn't choose to do it, they were forced to become entrepreneurs. But how do you become an entrepreneur? First, you borrow. And usually you borrow it from the landlord. The landlord lends you the money to pay him rent, with interest. So you see the reversal? Instead of finance coming at the end, we used to have production, then exchange or distribution, and then finally finance. Now we have finance first. First, at the beginning there was the loan. Once the loan comes in, you hire the workers, you pay the rent, immediately you have distribution. So you have finance first, distribution second. The last thing that happens is production. So finance suddenly acquires a very special place in capitalism. Now, the beauty and ugliness of finance, of banking, is that it is a magical process. Because once we move from the landlord to Edison and Henry Ford, it is impossible to finance capitalism simply by the accumulated wealth of some rich person like the Lord. There was never enough money in the hands of any financier to provide Edison with the capital, with the money he needed in order to set up his networked firm. So you needed banks to conjure up money from nothing. And this is how finance has been working ever since the second industrial revolution. How? By creating money from thin air. There is a common fallacy in the popular culture that we live in, that banks operate like vaults, whereby you and I put our savings in, and somebody else goes to the bank and borrows money that comes from our savings, and that the banker makes a profit as a result of the difference between the interest rate that he pays us for depositing our money into his vault and the interest rate that he charges the person that has borrowed money in order to invest in a shop, in a factory, whatever. That is not what is going on. If you go to the bank tomorrow morning and you get a loan from the bank, the money is going to come out of thin air. The bank will create it out of nothing. It's really very simple. You get $100,000 to buy a house, to buy whatever, to invest in a business. What will happen is somebody's going to type 100,000, 100,000 into your bank account. So it's conjured up. The ancient Greeks had a word for money, nomisma, or coin, which comes from the verb nomizo, which means to imagine. So Aristotle defined the value of money as a common fiction since the ancient times. This is exactly what it is. So the banker simply types the money in there. You put your card in the ATM, and suddenly, you have 100,000. Somebody typed 100,000 on the system. And then what you can do is you can use web banking. You can wire the money. If you buy a car or a house, it goes to the bank account of the vendor. If you invest in a shop, it goes to the landlord, to another bank account, with the same banking system. It doesn't matter whether it's the same bank or not. So these digits that were typed into your account simply are transferred to another account. That's all that happens. Now, the hope of the banker is that you are going to use this money productively, you're going to earn money from that, and then you will give the banker the money that will effectively tie up that loose end with interest. Now, to the extent that this works, and it really works magnificently, in my book I relate this in the form of a metaphor, a science fiction metaphor. It's a bit like a banker being the specially gifted magician who has a very long arm and can push his arm, it's usually a he, so allow me not to say she or he, right? Through the timeline. He pushes his hand into the future, grabs value that has not been created yet, brings it, snatches it from the future, brings it into the present, and gives it to you. Hopefully, you do productive things, and you create a value that will repay the future. This is my preferred metaphor for what bankers do. But once they learn the beauty and the glory of doing this, and they are privileged, in a privileged spot, because they can take value from the future, bring it to the present. They don't do any work themselves. And because they are the mediators between future and present value, they're ultra-rich, and not only ultra-rich, but central in societal processes, political processes. Yeah? So if you do this and it works, why not do more of it? Keep snatching more value from the future and bringing it to the present, and more and more. At some point, the present can no longer produce the value that it needs to produce in order to repay the present. And at that point, suddenly, those of us who have borrowed money, or some of us, have no capacity to repay it. A recession begins. People that work for us lose their jobs. They cannot repay their own loans, and then suddenly, the book of the bank is full of loans that are non-performing. At that point, if you and I, or those of us who have some money in the bank, realize that this is happening, we panic, we rush to the bank, this is a bank run, we ask for the cash is not there. And then you have the financial crisis that we had in this country and in Europe from the 1840s onwards. Now, to a very large extent, the United States of America, the way you understand your own country now, is the product of their political response to a sequence of financial crises beginning from the 1840s. Even the creation of the Federal Reserve in the beginning of the 20th century was a result of J.P. Morgan saying, I've had enough of bailing out my mates. Let's create a Federal Reserve that is going to be doing the job. And of course, he created it. And it was all stitched up amongst the bankers. Think of all the great institutions of this country, like Social Security, food stamps. They're the result of 1929. It's what brought this nation together, what created the United States of America the way you understand it. It's a sequence of financial collapses that puts together nations and polities and democratic processes. So let me go back to the beginning. We used to have one sphere of power. It was political, economic, cultural, military. Power had many different facets, but it was one sphere in which it emerged from. Then it separated into two spheres, the political sphere and the economic sphere. And as it did, the political sphere was increasingly democratized. Why? Because all the important decisions were moving to the economic sphere. So legitimacy, political legitimacy, and the capacity of the regime, of the system that we live in, to maintain itself and to be sustainable through the common belief amongst the people that this is a legitimate system, was based on democratization, of giving people the idea that they had control over their communities, the nation, their politics. But this democratization was only accepted by the proponents of liberalism to the extent that all the important decisions were migrating from the political sphere as the political sphere was democratized. Women understand that. It's like, the feminization of certain professions. When women moved into teaching, teaching lost its power. When they moved into health, in Greece now, a majority of judges are women. And you should see the judicial system collapsing. So it's a very, very similar process that we see. Power is migrating from the economic sphere to the political sphere, and the political sphere is democratized, increasingly. Now, something fundamental happened beginning in this country in the 1970s. After the end of Bretton Woods, which was what? What was Bretton Woods? Let's not get complicated. It was the globalization of the New Deal. Roosevelt's New Deal in 1933, which was, what was the basic idea? To put the financial genie, the banking genie, back into its bottle, to make banking boring, effectively to ban bankers from doing things that allowed too much money to be created and too many bubbles to be built up, mobilizing idle savings, the idle savings of the richer members of society, and putting those idle savings, turning them into a force in the public interest, infrastructural works, public works, education, social security, and so on. That was the New Deal. In 1944, towards the end of the war, the New Dealers extended that New Deal internationally, as Europe was just a pile of ashes. Japan, you don't need me to explain what happened to Japan in 1945. So Bretton Woods, it was a magnificent system. Think about it. The United States officialdom in DC effectively designed a global capitalist system that was like a planned economy. You have fixed exchange rates, 4% interest rates forever, 20 years of 4% interest rates, no ups and downs. It was maybe plus or minus 0.1%. So you knew what your mortgage rate would be in the next 20 years. You knew if you wanted to change dollars for British pounds, you knew how many pounds you would get. You would get the same quantity year in, year out. So it was a world which was a nightmare for financiers. And of course, that was by design. Did you know that in the Bretton Woods Conference in New Hampshire in 1944, Roosevelt imposed one single rule on his own. The rest he left to his minions. There were representatives from 100 different countries. Most of them already, they were not even liberated yet. They were under occupation because it was 1944. The Second World War had not ended. Experts, diplomats, politicians, and so on. One species of humanity was banned from entering the Washington Hotel. Bankers. A whole monetary global system was created on condition that bankers would not be part of it. Yeah? Interesting. If anybody proposed this today, they would immediately be branded as raving communist lunatics. This was Bretton Woods, 1944. It's important to think back about possibilities when we think of what is possible. Well, what happened in 1944 in Bretton Woods in 1930, 1931 in this country would have been completely pie in the sky. So anyway, but that system collapsed towards the end of the 1960s, officially 15th of August 1971, with Nixon's announcement that it's kaput, it's finished. I'm not going to go into this. But what happened after that was a very interesting, fascinating reversal in the flow of trade and money around the world. Before the collapse of Bretton Woods, what was happening was this. This is how Bretton Woods was designed. America was a surplus country. The country with surpluses, with profits, especially after the Second World War, was the only creditor country, the only country that had surpluses, financial surpluses, surpluses of goods, a net exporter. And what the United States administration did as part of Bretton Woods was to say, okay, the only way of preventing a return of the Great Depression to this land by 1949, they were very worried about 1949 because it was 1929 plus 20. The only way of preventing it is to make sure that, okay, number one, we convert all the factories from military production to civilian production, producing white goods instead of tanks and bullets, producing cars instead of aircraft carriers. Right, but that's not enough, because those factories during the war economy were so productive in this country that they were capable of producing so many washing machines, tractors, and cars that Americans would simply not have enough use for them. So the only way of preventing the Great Depression from returning was by selling them to the Europeans. But the Europeans didn't have money. So New Dealers, being very practical people, said, we'll give them the money. It's what's called the Marshall Aid Plan. Surplus recycling. For 20 years, United States was recycling about 70% of American profits in Japan and in Europe, because this is what you do if you're a clever hegemon. What you do is you make sure that the only way that you can continue to have surpluses vis-a-vis somebody else is to finance them. Because if you don't, then they won't be able to afford to buy your stuff. Then you won't be able to have surpluses. The problem was, however, that those surpluses disappeared by the late 60s. America shifted from a surplus position to a deficit position. Both the government went in deficit and the American economy developed a trade deficit. It is fascinating that what happened after the collapse of Bretton Woods had been imagined by some smart fellows in this country. Remember Henry Kissinger? Yeah. Exactly my feelings. But he's a smart cookie, right? And in 1970, a year before the end of Bretton Woods, he was not yet Secretary of State. He was still head of the National Security Council. And of course, he's a cold warrior, geopolitical thinker. He thinks in terms of, a bit like Metternich would have in the 19th century. He comes from the same part of the world, has the same accent. So he asked all the people that were working for him the pertinent question. Now that the United States is shifting into a deficit position, we used to be a surplus, now we're going to become a deficit country. How can we maintain our global hegemony? Because it has never happened in the past. All empires, superpowers, fell once they became deficit countries or economic blocs. So he was worried about that. He didn't give a damn about economics, but he cared about power. A young man wrote a memo, 3/4 of a page, in reply. It was the most brilliant reply, and the one that really explains what happened between the 1970s and 2008 in the world, and of course in the United States. His answer was, it doesn't really matter whose surpluses are being recycled. What really matters to maintain in control is to be the one who is recycling other people's surpluses. Get it? We can maintain our superpower status, our hegemony, as long as we do the recycling of surpluses, even if the surpluses are not ours. Think about it. This is exactly the model that we have been living through between the 1970s and 2008. America turned into a deficit country. And Donald Trump is complaining, we have a huge trade deficit with China, with Germany, we need to eliminate it. Either he's completely unschooled, or he's lying, or both. I added a third option. Because, look, the globalization would not have happened without the American deficits. The American trade deficit operated like a gigantic vacuum cleaner that was sucking into this country the net exports of Germany, of Holland, of France, of Japan, and later, of course, of China, keeping those factories going at full blast. And this deficit kept increasing. It is this increasing American trade deficit that kept globalized capitalism in rude health. Now, of course, the question then is, how was it being paid for? Because Greece had a big deficit, and look at what happened to us. Well, this is the exorbitant privilege of the United States of America. At the very same time that the trade deficit was expanding, the rest of the world was sending to this country 70% of all profits the Germans made, the Dutch made, the Japanese made, and the Chinese are making. 70% of global profits were coming into Wall Street, seeking higher returns, being used to purchase US Treasury bills, American government debt. And so you had a pure recycling loop. So recycling was discovered by this young man, whose name, by the way, is Paul Volcker, who then became the chairman of the Fed. And who, just a week before he assumed the position of chairman of the Fed, in a lecture he gave at the University of Warwick in England, he said, this is the time when a controlled disintegration of the world economy is in the interest of the United States of America. Verbatim. I've learned this off by heart because it's so exciting. The controlled disintegration of the world economy. So that's what he meant. So you had this amazing system where you have increasing imbalances globally, America growing its deficits, Germany and Japan and then China growing its surpluses. When we increase our deficit, we are creating an imbalance. When somebody else is increasing their surplus, that's an imbalance. And globalization was based on this. Financialization. What's financialization? Why was Wall Street allowed to go crazy? Why were all the checks and balances that the new dealers introduced and Bretton Woods introduced, why did they go to the dogs? Why did Larry Summers, I believe he's got some connection with this place, why was he allowed to commit a crime against logic and humanity, to unleash the Wall Street bankers from their shackles, the result being 2008? The answer is because without unleashing the Wall Street bankers, it was impossible to close that loop. The only way you could have this model of the world economy where the United States deficit was keeping the rest of globalization going, with the rest of the world sending its surpluses into Wall Street, for Wall Street to close the loop and pay for the deficit, was to let the Wall Street bankers do as they pleased. And when you do let the Wall Street bankers do as they please, you know what they do? You give a banker a few billion every day for 5 minutes. Just park 5 billion with a banker for 5 minutes every day. This is to invite them to create very sophisticated bets using that 5 billion every day that they are always going to win. If I were to give you 5 billion every day for 5 minutes, you will work out ways of making a load of money, and exponentially increasing load of money. Anyway, the problem is that they built so many pyramids of financialized derivatives on top of this tsunami of capital that the rest of the world was saying, that it combusted in 2008, and the result was what we're facing. So the point I'm making is that first you had the joint sphere of power. Then that bisected into the political and the economic sphere. Then after the 1970s, the end of Bretton Woods, the economic sphere also divided and multiplied between the industrial sphere and the financial sphere. And all power ended up with finance. Because if you allow bankers to push their hand into the future so majestically, frequently, and without any kind of control, to bring value that has not been produced yet into the future and effectively to appropriate it themselves. And then you also say to them that they're too big to fail, and when they fail, then austerity for all is combined with socialism for the bankers. Then they have no reason why not to keep undermining capitalism again and again and again. So remember the question with which I started. Why do politicians seem to be so much less talented today than they were, 40 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago? Well, the answer is because the political sphere is completely powerless. The spheres that now have acquired power are the economic sphere and, magnificently, the financial sphere. So if you're a young, talented person who wants to change the world, who wants to do things, who's not very ideological or historically minded, who wants power? What do you want to be, President of the United States or CEO of Goldman Sachs? CEO of Goldman Sachs. I remember the one longish conversation I had with Barack Obama when I was the finance minister of Greece. The first thing he said to me was, I feel solidarity for the Greek people, and we are behind you, but there's not much I can do to help. Okay? And then he immediately, without me saying anything, he went into a soliloquy justifying himself by saying that, you know, when I got elected, I realized there was nothing I could do because Wall Street had just imploded and I had to save them. And that was, he said, political poison for me. Now, I don't know whether he believed it or not. And I can't see how he can explain the fact that he appointed Larry Summers to sort out the mess. Unless, of course, you know, you adopt the cynical view that it takes a murderer to work out how the criminal justice system should be reformed. So this is effectively the point I'm making. So, is capitalism consistent or sustainable within a democratic polity? Can it coexist with democracy? Absolutely not. Because capitalism is generating this shift of power away from the political sphere. And even if you have fantastically scripted constitutions, beautiful congresses with wonderful procedures and so on, power is going to shift away from those processes. They're going to become fig leaves for a system where power lives somewhere else. In my first meeting of finance ministers in Europe, I was exposed to this harsh reality, which I always knew. But it's one thing to know it as a radical lefty that nobody, you know, that theorizes and puts forward, you know, various working hypotheses in an academic environment. It's quite another to be told straight in your face. That was the beauty of those few months I spent in government, was exactly that. I didn't have to theorize anymore. I went to my first meeting of the Eurogroup. The Eurogroup is the meeting of the European Union finance ministers of the countries that share the same currency, the euro. So I walked in there and I tried to be as moderate and as sensible and as friendly as anyone who comes from a country that is bankrupt and whose new government has a title, or the party that won, coalition of the radical left. Yeah? So there I was, the Minister of Finance representing the coalition of the radical left in that cesspool of conservatism. And I tried to be, you know, all I said was that we are facing a challenge, colleagues, I said. There is the principle, I said, of continuity in democracies, in liberal democracies. In other words, we're not going to start at year zero just because we were just elected. We have obligations to you that previous governments, Greek governments, have assumed, and which, of course, we were against, our party was against, but nevertheless, our state, because of the principle of continuity, still has these obligations to you, and therefore I cannot dismiss them. I have to take them seriously. I am obliged by the principle of continuity to At the same time, there is another principle, the principle of democracy. I could see that they didn't like that very much. And the principle of democracy is very simple. I have a mandate from the people of Greece to challenge all these obligations that we have, this particular fiscal and monetary policy that you've been imposing upon my country, which led to a Great Depression, which led me to be here, because if we didn't have a Great Depression, the Greeks were not stupid enough to vote for me. I mean, they didn't just become left-wingers. You know, our party went from 4% to 40% in 2.5 years because of the Great Depression. I didn't put it in those very words, but you can imagine. But more or less, this was my... I was trying to be extremely open to them and moderate and conciliatory with Wolfgang Schäuble, the finance minister of Germany. Okay. And I said, well, what happens in a democracy when two principles clash? The principle of continuity and the principle of democracy. Well, we sit around the table like civilized people and we find a compromise. This is what democracies do. Liberal democracies, yes? I sit down. The French minister loved what I said. Of course, you know, just complete hot air. Yes, 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 yes. I could see Wolfgang Schäuble, the German finance minister. He was looking at me with, eyes that felt like laser beams. And he gets the floor and he said, one sentence, which is the one that I'm going to leave you with. Elections cannot be allowed to change economic policy. Got it? My response was, this is excellent news to the Chinese Communist Party because they believe that too. And I then came up with a proposal. This is why they hated me. I was very moderate. I said, in that case, Wolfgang, let's ban elections in bankrupt countries. Let's come out and declare that in the European Union, you can only have democracy if you're a creditor country. If you're a debtor country, no democracy, elections cannot be allowed to change anything because we have a loan agreement. We have a debtor's prison. Let's put Greece in the workhouse. I didn't say all these things, but I did say the thing about the Chinese Communist Party. And also the proposal that we suspend elections while a country is in the red, in the European Union. That would be more honest. So the reason why I'm mentioning this is that Schäuble was right. In the capitalist, the globalized, financialized capitalism that we have created, elections cannot be allowed to change economic policy. Because economic policy simply springs out of the processes that I described that leave absolutely no room for anything beyond a semblance of a democratic process that legitimizes the lack of democracy. We live in pure, ironclad oligarchies which require, for legitimation purposes and for their reproduction, that we think that we live in democracies. Now, the tragedy is that capitalism is being overthrown. Not by the left. We are useless. Progressives, left-wingers, are a catastrophe. Has anybody seen The Life of Brian, Monty Python's movie? Remember the opening scene when they all hate each other? The Jews of the Liberation Front of Judea, again, whose worst enemy is the Liberation People's Front of Judea. That's the left. We are sectarian. We hate each other more than we hate anything else. Yeah? No, but and of course, and when we did overthrow capitalism, we created the Gulag. So we are a disaster. Doesn't mean we shouldn't try again and to do it properly and democratically. But let's face it, capitalism is overthrowing itself with no help from us. And it's doing it in two ways. Firstly, think of 2008. This financialization process that I described imploded under the weight of its own hubris. And the result is a never-ending crisis. Don't believe anybody who tells you that the 2008 crisis ended. It never ended. It is continuing. It is mutating. It's taking different forms. It migrates. It goes to different parts of the world. It takes, for instance, in Germany, it takes the form of negative interest rates that are eating into the pension funds of the average middle-class person, who then turns against the political system and votes for the fascists of the Alternative für Deutschland. They don't have unemployment, but they have this sense of deflation of their hard-earned savings that creates the rise of xenophobia, racism, and the ultra-right. In my country, we have a Nazi party in parliament because we have a Great Depression, because we have an unemployment rate of 30%. And we have no interest rates because nobody is lending to anyone, because everybody's bankrupt. Yeah? In China, you have an investment rate, the proportion of GDP, of national income, that goes into investment is gigantic. It's 48%. 48 cents to every dollar earned in China goes into investment. Now, investment is a good thing, but overinvestment simply means that the Chinese authorities have given up on the West. Because, let's face it, the only reason why you don't have a Great Depression in this country today is because in 2008, which was your version our version of 1929, two things happened differently to what happened in 1929. One was that the Federal Reserve started printing money as if there is no tomorrow. Didn't happen in 1929. And the second thing was China boosted its investment ratio so high in order to rebalance global capitalism. They did it very well, but it's not sustainable. So Europe is not sustainable, China is not sustainable, and the United States today, which is celebrating growth, what growth? You have 2.5% growth. All the things that shouldn't grow, grow. The things that should grow are not growing. You do not have any serious investment in good quality jobs in this country. You have wage stagnation. You have a situation, people say, oh, it's, this idiocy of the Democratic Party that Putin won the election against Hillary Clinton. Come on, wake up. You cannot say to Trump voters that they're idiots and Putin duped them. I mean, you can say that, but then that's it. You lose them forever. And it's also not true. People say to me, well, how do you explain that Trump won? I'm an economist, so I look at numbers. The number that I think is most spectacular in this country is that in 2016, more than half of the families in this country could not afford the cheapest new car, which cost $14,000. Either they didn't have the money, or they didn't have the money and they did not have the credit ratings necessary to borrow $14,000. More than half of the families cannot afford the cheapest car. That's why Trump got elected. Because Obama failed spectacularly to shift the burdens of the crisis of the financial sector onto the 0.1%. So, I've spoken for far too long. Let's end on a positive note. Shall we? Technically, it's really very simple how to solve the problem or how to begin a process. We need a New Deal, except that this must be an international New Deal, exactly as the New Deal was in 1933, but globally. That's not new. Bretton Woods was an international New Deal. So we need a new Bretton Woods. We need progressives in this country, progressives in Europe, to get their act together and start collaborating. Because, the bankers are very good at being internationalists. They love each other and they work very closely together. The fascists are fantastic. Trump loves Le Pen, Orban, the Alternative for Deutschland. They love each other, they cooperate. They have very good... Only we progressives fail to get together and start believing that it is possible to do that which has already been done before. It's not pie-in-the-sky stuff. Now, this in order to ameliorate the effects of the ongoing crisis after 2008. Then, once we stabilize the world, like Bretton Woods stabilized the world after the Second World War, then we can start thinking about post-capitalism. Because we must. Capitalism is overturning itself, not only through its crisis, but also through the technologies that it is creating. 3D printing, artificial intelligence, the internet, will make sure that in a few years there will be no need to have a corporation. Corporations will lack their raison d'etre. The only reason why you have General Motors is economies of scale. Economies of scale are dying because of the new technologies that capitalism is creating. So you are going to have a situation in which we are going to have magnificent productivity, magnificent capacity to produce stuff, but the large majority will not be able to buy any of it. So that will be a crisis of not just the poor and the have-nots, but also the haves. But we must never believe that because there is going to be a crisis of capitalism, because capitalism is going to undermine and overthrow itself, good things will happen. In the 1930s, capitalism imploded and Nazism happened. So we can have one certainty: capitalism cannot maintain itself. Something else, another system of organizing economic and political life is going to follow. And we better make sure that the way in which we choose as a species, as a humanity, that different way of doing things is selected democratically. Because even though democracy takes too long, as Oscar Wilde said, socialism would never happen because it takes too many long evenings. And it's tedious. There's no doubt about that. If you've been to a political meeting, you know how tedious it is. It's the only choice we have. Thankfully, we are creating the technologies that will make these debates both more manageable and more hopeful in terms of delivering a future that resembles, as I say in the book, Star Trek and not the Matrix. Thank you.
So, Yanis, you're a very interesting combination of idealism and pragmatism. You identified the problem that we have here, which led to somehow Trump being elected. Yet, that terrible income inequality, which has gotten way worse in the last 12 months and looks like it's going to get worse, even more, get worse again, did not produce enough people to elect Bernie Sanders. And I went to his rallies and he said great things. Do you think that this country just can't wrap its head around that word socialist? And that's my question, is does it have to repackage the thinking?
Well, I used to think that until Bernie Sanders called himself a socialist and won the primary election before it was stolen from him. Bernie Sanders won the election, or he would have won the election if the National Democratic Committee did not do its utmost to perform a coup d'etat against him. And this, I'm stating this as an accusation. The Democratic Party is its own worst enemy.
So given that, this is the substrate that we have to work with, how do we change the thinking? If we want the things that that party is proposing, how do we get the electorate to change their voting? Why did they vote for Trump? Why?
Well, firstly, the abstention rate was quite high. A lot of good people could simply not bring themselves to vote for Hillary, and they didn't vote at all. And many others. I wasn't here during your election campaign, but I was in Britain before the Brexit referendum, and I believe that there are great similarities between the two. And I remember I was campaigning against Brexit in Britain, in the same way I would have campaigned against Trump here, of course. And I remember asking people who were not racist, who were not xenophobic, who were not right-wing, who were not anti-European, why are you voting for Brexit? And the answer had nothing to do with Europe. The answer was this: if I vote to remain in the European Union, those bastards that have been treating me like a discarded piece of rag, a discarded rag, are going to be very happy. So I'm going to cast my vote in a manner that maximizes the discomfort of those who've been treating me as if I'm not a human. Now, I don't know, you have to tell me whether this is an appropriate comparison to what was going on here. A lot of people who voted for Trump simply wanted to punish the establishment. And they wanted, I think that there's quite a lot of supporting evidence. Of course, there are racists, and there are Nazis, and there are right-wingers, and bigots, and misogynists who voted for Trump. But I don't think that those were the ones who made the difference. The ones who made the difference were the ones who could not afford a car, the ones who had believed in Obama and who voted for Obama in 2008. I'm reading at the data, and there seems to be a very large number of voters who voted for Obama in 2008 and Trump in 2016. Now, that cannot be explained on the basis of racism. It cannot be explained on the basis of misogyny. It is simply, to hell with you. I am not going to vindicate, yet again, a presidential candidate who goes into Wall Street 6 months before the presidential election, gives private speeches for hundreds of thousands of dollars, and, excuse the language, shits on people like me in front of the bankers, calling me names, and promising to them that they will be allowed to continue doing that which has put us and our country in this position.
So, trying to be optimistic
Yeah.
for a moment. If we were trying to create some kind of apparatus, I mean, in the 50s, Roosevelt did the very thing that they said was impossible. He put 90% tax on corporate America to fund all these great schemes, the Social Security system, Medicare. These things were made possible, but the workers had unions then, quite strong unions. Now that's all been taken away. How are people going to organise and overthrow the system? As you say, I mean, it may implode, but in the interim, people are just surviving on $10 an hour wages or not surviving. So where is the impetus for revolution?
Well, you do not need punitive tax rates now. You don't need 90%. This was a gimmick anyway.
No, but it worked. It worked.
Yeah, I mean, it was more of a political stunt. I don't believe that it is necessary to have such high tax rates. But what you do need is you need to change the discourse in a way that appeals not only to those who would have joined trade unions, but to people who would never have imagined themselves to be radical or even progressive. So let me give you an example. Take NAFTA. There's a lot of discussion in this country now about NAFTA. The liberal establishment says, oh, free trade is everything. The pie is going to shrink if you do away with it. But some people in the Rust Belt say, well, that's your pie, that's not my pie. My pie has disappeared a long time ago. So if I can manage to hold on to a few, steel workers' jobs by means of tariffs, let's do it, because it's better than all of us being thrown into the dustbin. Why not change the narrative and to say, yes, we want to renegotiate NAFTA along the following lines. If Mexico wants to continue to have, or Mexican capitalists want to continue to have free access to the American market, Mexico is going to have to introduce a minimum wage in Mexico that provides a living wage by Mexican standards, not by American standards, to the workers who work in the factories that produces stuff that are then transported over to the United States. Now, that is a progressive renegotiation of NAFTA. Not tariffs, but minimum living wages in the poorer countries. Okay, so that way...
Not building a wall.
Of course not building a wall. But then you wouldn't need to build the wall.
Of course you wouldn't, yeah? No.
So that is one example. Take, for instance, the question about the health service here, the health system. Well, you don't have a health system, the absence of a health system. Obamacare was a complete disaster. Obamacare is an affront against logic. The idea of universal cover is absolutely essential. But also the idea that the state is going to be subsidizing private companies to provide public health without any controls regarding the prices of the services and the pharmaceuticals is a catastrophe. It's like effectively subsidizing the private insurers. This is why, of course, they contributed massively to Obama's campaign without the so-called public option. It's ludicrous. So how about the following argument about having a proper national health service, a public health service system in the United States, so that we can introduce tax cuts? Think about that. That would really throw the Republicans, wouldn't it? Because your health system is the most expensive in the world. You pay twice as much on health than the rest of the world, and you have far worse outcomes. So imagine that you created a proper public system. You'd save a huge amount of money, public money, and then you could give them away as tax cuts. But why not also say that those tax cuts will go to the lowest wage earners, not to the top? So that's how you change the debate. You get out of the way of the stereotype that the Republicans are trying to create for you.
Absolutely.
And you subvert the dominant way of thinking.
So I would like to hog the questioning, but I don't think it's fair, because I'm sure there are lots of good questions that are going to come from the audience. So I'm going to open up the questions. And
okay.
If you could confine it to one, I would be appreciative.
It may be 1.5. I thought for a minute your talk was going to be almost entirely about Harvard. Marshall, who announced it at Harvard commencement, Kissinger, and then Larry Summers. I have this idea that maybe Obama was put in the White House to bail out Harvard, whose endowment went from losing $11 billion to regaining it. I think many people in this country are still not convinced that Obama did have a choice. Now, you said, I believe that he did, but can you be a little more specific about, and you sort of writ large, you talk about a New Deal. Could you be more specific about what a person in the White House could have done, what it would have looked like that would have been more like bailing out Wall Street, more like bailing out Main Street than bailing out Wall Street? And can you explain why the social democratic politics of building a politics where we control the government and regulate capitalism is not the way to go, but some other alternative politics is what you're implying, but you haven't really, I don't think, spelled out.
Okay, I'll start from the second part. Look, the New Deal that I am suggesting as a first step is social democratic, but in the good old-fashioned sense of it. So you need social democratic measures in order to stabilize the political economy before we can have a genuine conversation about what comes next, the more radical part. Creating, for instance, changing corporate law. I mean, corporate law is a political value judgment. So when some corporation goes bust, who gets paid first amongst the creditors is a political decision. So why not change it? Why have the bankers get paid first and the workers last? Why allow people to own shares in a company in which they don't work? This is very, very radical, I know. But imagine having a situation where you can only have shares in a company in which you actually provide labor. Now, then you have socialism, but without state control. So that's the part of the second question. But let's go back to Obama. Did he have a choice? Of course he had a choice. He could have appointed as instead of appointing Tim Geithner and Larry Summers, he could have appointed Elizabeth Warren with a mandate to save the banks, but to expropriate the bankers, which is not a new idea. In 1992, the Swedish banks, actually all the Scandinavian banks, went bust. And what the governments did then was to say to the bankers, okay, out. They took over the banks, they nationalized them, put in a new board of directors, and within 2 years they had sold them back to the private sector, but cleansed. The original bankers had gone, okay, with new regulations. He didn't do that. He left, Jamie Dimon, Goldman Sachs intact, all the structures of power. In 2009, when he moved into the White House, for about 6 to 8 months, I grant you, not more than that, he had a window of opportunity, he had the whole nation behind him, he could have done that, even Republicans would have, even libertarians would have approved of expropriating the bankers. He didn't. Instead, he allowed Larry and Tim to create the so-called Summers-Geithner plan. If you haven't studied that, go and study it. It is a remarkable, ingenious way of conjuring up around $9 trillion and giving it to the bankers without anybody realizing it. You remember the bailout that Hank Paulson came up with was $700 billion, and everybody went, $700 billion. Initially, he was defeated in Congress, and then he managed to push it through. $700 billion is peanuts. Geithner and Summers created $9 trillion without anybody realizing it. Okay? So Obama had a choice to do it, and he did it. Okay? Now we are paying for it because Trump is president.
I've been very concerned lately about China and sort of we have transferred so much money from our economy over to China by buying all those things and supporting their economy over there so they could make more and more money. They are now all over Africa, buying things and investing over there and getting those countries dependent on them and supporting, non-democratic people. And I'm just
like
wondering,
whom?
Well,
we are in a country that supports Saudi Arabia.
Yes, that's true. Right. So
suddenly we have a problem with, superpowers supporting non-democratic people?
Yes, yes, I do, but I also am just concerned that we've sort of created the economic power that China sort of has now, and they're using it, I fear, going to be using it against us eventually and against the better interests of a lot of people.
Allow me to put your mind to rest.
Okay, great.
You shouldn't worry about that.
Okay.
It's very simple. And let me explain why you shouldn't worry about that. But please continue.
Well, I mean, they're in Africa. They're lending money to countries to build ports and different infrastructure.
To build what?
Port,
harbors. And what's wrong with that?
And, well, because...
Countries that need ports get ports.
But they're making people dependent on... I mean, I know, it's the same thing that we've done, which is horrible around the world.
They are far more humanistic than the United States ever was.
Really? Okay.
Absolutely.
Great. So...
Let me give you an example. Of course they are peddling for influence.
Yeah.
Yeah? But they are non-interventionist. Absolutely non-interventionist in a way that Europeans, the West, has never managed to fathom.
But I have a feeling they have a longer-term thought process that is more interventionist.
But
anyway,
let's judge what we see. Let's judge what.
Okay.
Well, let's start at the beginning. The Chinese never asked Apple to go to Shenzhen and produce all the iPhones. It was Steve Jobs that decided that. Yeah? Mm-hmm. It was not China that went to Washington, D.C. and demanded that they buy a third of your national debt. If they hadn't bought it, you would be in serious trouble.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Number 3. I did allude to this in my talk. If in 2008 China had not cranked up their credit bubble, you would be in a new Great Depression now.
Mm-hmm.
So, China, the United States, and the European Union are absolutely synergistic, and they need one another in a way that if we fail to acknowledge and to nurture, billions of people, including the majority of the people in this country, are going to suffer. Now, I am not going to stand here and defend China and the Chinese Communist Party. I already made some negative remarks about the Chinese Communist Party in referring to, their attitudes as being compatible with those of Wolfgang Schäuble. My concern about China is the authoritarian manner in which the Chinese regime is treating the Chinese people. As a Democrat, I have a problem with this. Mind you, I have to tell you that, from my understanding of China, it's a very interesting social experiment, in the sense that at the local level, or the regional level, you now have a boisterous democracy. At the local and regional level. Even with popular success stories in overthrowing local authorities, local bureaucrats who have been corrupt, who have been this, who have been that, who have been the other. When it comes to the influence of China outside its borders, I have to say, firstly, it's quite remarkable that they don't seem to have any military ambitions. Secondly, Africa. I'll give you an example, a specific example. Ethiopia. 2004, because I happened to be there, and I have some first-hand experience of it. They went into Ethiopia. I'll tell you why they went into Ethiopia, because they suspected there was oil. Because China is a major industrial power, but it lacks primary resources. Now, instead of going into Africa with troops, colonially, destroying the country, killing people like the West has done for the last 100 years, what they did was they went to Addis Ababa and they said to the government, we would like, we can see you have problems with your infrastructure, we would like to build some new airports, upgrade your railway system, create a telephone system, and rebuild your roads. And we'll do this all for free. No strings attached. We don't want anything from you. And they did. Why did they do it? Because it's soft power. Because because they knew that if oil is discovered, and it was discovered later, then, of course, the Ethiopian government will be much more open to Chinese oil companies coming there. They have never combined their investment with imperialistic view. When I was Minister of Finance, I had a very interesting experience with COSCO, one of the Chinese national companies that in the end bought the port of Piraeus. When I moved into the ministry, I found a contract from the previous government that they had already sold the port of Piraeus for a pittance and under ridiculous conditions to the Chinese, under the guidance, of course, of the European Union and the International Monetary Fund as well. And in other words, as a minister, I was bound to a particular deal that was terrible for Greece. And I went to the Chinese and discussed it with them. And I was really astonished. I said to them, look, you're paying too little, you're not committing to a sufficient level of investment, and you are treating our workers as fodder. You are effectively subcontracting labor to horrible companies that exploit the workers, and I can't deal with this. Effectively, I proposed to them to renegotiate the contract. So instead of getting 67% of the shares of the port, they would get with the same price 51. The remaining shares would go into the Greek pension fund system in order to bolster the capitalization of the public pensions. Secondly, I want you to commit to 180 million euros of investment within 12 months. And thirdly, proper collective bargaining with the trade unions and no subcontracting of labor. And to my astonishment, they said, okay. Can you imagine if that was a German company or an American company? That's why I'm saying I don't think you should worry.
Okay, I won't. Thank you.
Hi, big fan Yanis. Nice to see you in person. And I hope you don't mind that I'll struggle to give you a short question instead of an essay. So basically, one angle that I kind of feel was missing from tonight's talk is the angle of class formations. Mm-hmm. So the New Deal was born out of, I believe, about easily 50, 60 years of left-wing organizing among the industrial working classes who basically, you know, as we would always say in our slogans, had their hands on the wheels. When they went on strike, they could stop production, stop the flow of profits, and so on and so on. And so by the time the Great Depression came, there was a crisis. There was a place for labor and the left at the bargaining table. I guess what I want to ask is, let's take neoliberalism out of kind of good faith and say there really was a change in the class formation that allowed them to just throw out Bretton Woods and say, we don't want to commit to this deal anymore. You don't have the power, you know. Effectively, your bargaining terms, oh, laborers, are not so good anymore. Mm-hmm. So then that leaves us today. Where are we? Who does have their hands on the wheel? You know, I mean, here we are, Cambridge, Massachusetts. Large portion of the population works in white-collar professions. Mm-hmm. Many of them are homeowners. In traditional, you know, there aren't a lot of traditional industrial workers in this room. On the other hand, the traditional industrial workers in Ohio or wherever are losing their jobs quite rapidly due to mechanization and offshoring. So, you know, who can put the worker's gun to the capitalist class's head anymore?
Good question, but I have to disagree with you on one thing.
And sorry to sound a bit tanky on you.
No, you're not saying. No. It is the pertinent question, the one you asked. I don't have a splendid answer to it, I can assure you. But where I want to disagree with you is that in 1933 or 32, it was the labor movement that imposed its will using its power. There was no power. The 1929 the great crash and then the depression that followed completely depleted trade unions of any bargaining power. When you have a situation where you've got hordes of people outside the factory gates begging to be allowed into work at any wage, you don't have trade union power. So it was a political process that led not a a labor process that led to the New Deal. And let's not forget that FDR was not a revolutionary leader, he was a patrician. Yeah, he was a bourgeois. Even Keynes, I mean, think about Keynes. Keynes hated the workers. He loathed trades unions. The reason why he introduced Keynesian economics, his proposals, which included increasing wages and welfare states and fiscal spending, on fiscal stimulus and so on, was very simple. He wanted to preserve capitalism, and he understood that capitalism was not very good at preserving itself. That's a very large part of the motivation of Roosevelt. It was not that he was being pushed by the industrial might of the labor unions.
Well,
so that gives you a bit of hope. Since that didn't happen then, maybe we don't need strong trade unions today. Today, I think that from a class formation point of view, what worries me and what I think is should be the objective is how to organize the precariat, how to turn those who live a precarious existence, the Uberized workers, into a political force, because they now are falling through the cracks of society. They are like the lumpen proletariat used to be. They are disappearing. I mean, a person who works 18 hours a day in an Uber is not a person. It's a lost soul. It's a moving, monument to misanthropy. So that for me is a major question. But okay, allow me just to be a little to shift towards something that may sound science fiction, but I don't think it is. We need to think innovatively about collective action. I do not believe that the revolution is going to come through trade unions in industrial sites simply because they are fading, unless the robots organize. And they do the revolution on our behalf. You never know. I've read a science fiction novel where the computer in the end organized the revolution. No, but let me give you an example. Today you have millions of people who are being exploited by public utility companies that have been privatized and which are financialized. And they have already sold to financiers the next 20 years of the electricity bills that you will be paying. And as a result of this financialization, your bill is going up and up and up, completely disproportionately to the cost of producing electricity, water, whatever. What if we could work out which financial derivatives, which CDOs are packaging the bills in a particular neighborhood and another neighborhood and another neighborhood, and we organize through the internet so that we can have an electricity bill payment strike that is timed in such a way as to explode those CDOs and make them bankrupt. Now that's a form of collective action, which is using the financial instruments of the, this kind of network against it. We need to think beyond that, modern times Charlie Chaplin.
Thank you very much. Very interesting stuff.
Kalispera.
Kalispera.
That's all the Greek I know. So I originally tried to do a PhD on the topic you talked at length about the separation between political power and economic power, specifically about the European Union and how it sort of formalized this split between the political sphere is no longer has to do anything with what the people want with economic organization. No one wanted to touch that one with the 10-foot pole, so I'm doing something else now, but it remains my passion. But so to keep the question reasonably short, what is the one change, what are the one of the many changes you'd like to see in the structure of the European Union that could address this, if you could choose just one thing?
Right, well, I'll be very brief in my response. We need to federate. Because there are only two choices here. Either we break it up, which many people want, even on the left, thinking that that recoiling into the bosom of the nation state is somehow going to allow them to create socialism in one country. Yeah, right. Yeah. Or we're going to have to create, a democratic union. Now, the problem is that with this crisis that we have, which is both economic and political and moral, if you want, we can't have a serious discussion about federation because we have centrifugal forces that are pulling us apart. So this is why our movement, you may have heard of a movement that I'm part of, DiEM25, we're proposing what we call a European New Deal. A New Deal in order to stabilize and bring hope back so that we can have a discussion on how to federate.
Thank you very much.
I'm also going to ask a question about the European Union and about Greece and about the immigration problem, which is all the more on everyone's mind because of what Trump has just done with wiping out the agreement on the Iranian nuclear situation. I recently read that on the island of Lesbos, I believe, which is an island that receives a lot of the immigrants from the Middle East, from Syria, that Greeks were attacking the immigrants. And I read that I have read for years now that conditions in the camps are terrible.
Yeah.
And something that I have wondered about for years is why is it the immigrants from the Middle East and North Africa are coming to the south of Europe, the poorest part of Europe, and why is it that there is not some common effort, perhaps this is a very naive question, but some common effort to subsidize countries like Greece, which is in terrible economic straits, to deal more humanely with these people?
It's a fantastic question. Okay, let me answer in three parts. Firstly, inform you about what's going on in Lesbos, because Lesbos is very dear to us as Greeks, to our hearts, and we are devastated by what's going on. Firstly, let me be fair to the people of Lesbos. The vast majority of the people of Lesbos have been magnificent. For 3 years now, it's an island that is very depressed, financially, economically. It's a bit like Detroit. Think of Detroit. And you have 1 million people. It's an island of 17,000 people, and 1 million people came. And most of them passed through. Now we have 50,000 left. And they went on the shore, they picked them up, they opened their houses, they opened their shops and gave them food, of course for no money and so on, the vast majority. Of course, when you have a combination of the Great Depression that we have in Greece, you have Nazis, and add to this the European Union's attitude, which is effectively to turn Lesbos into a concentration camp. And the people of the Greeks who live there then become very susceptible to the toxic narrative of the Greek Nazis, who say to them, see, these bastards came here, and now we are, instead of being a beautiful Greek Aegean island in receiving tourists and doing well, we are ourselves part of a concentration camp. So it's very, very difficult to fight against this narrative. But I tell you what I think. So the situation on the ground, there are 3 camps. One is called Moria. It is the most notorious one. It is a camp that can hold under reasonable conditions, not good, but reasonable. 2,000 people, there are 10,000 people now in there. So they live in circumstances that do not befit a civilized part of the world. But that's on purpose. It is run by the European Union and the United Nations, and it is a cesspool of misery on purpose to deter others from coming. There are another 2 camps that local NGOs have created, and they're magnificent. They're absolutely magnificent. If you look at the circumstances in there, the people, the problem they have is that they don't have much capacity. So there are 300 families in one and 110 families in the other. But they live, it's actually quite heartwarming to see. Of course, the problem is that none of these people have any kind of guarantee of safety. I was talking to activists in the good camps who educate them, teach them English, their own language, because they have kids who speak Farsi, Persian, and they teach them computing, and they put a lot of effort in it, and it's really heartwarming. But they say to me, do you know the tragedy of not knowing what's going to happen tomorrow morning, because the police may come in, grab one of them, put them in chains, throw them on the boat back to Turkey. So you have no idea. Is this kid, you have a 12-year-old kid there, and his or her parents, are they going to be with us for a week, 2 weeks, 6 months, 2 years? The refugees don't know, so they can't plan their lives. The activists don't know. So what do you teach them? You teach very differently if you teach somebody for 2 weeks compared to if you know you will be teaching them for 2 years. The curriculum is different, right? And the local community doesn't even know. Is this camp here going to be permanent? Are we going to assimilate them? Are we going to live with these people forever? Because the local community will react differently if they knew that, and with some support from they don't know. And the worst part is that, the reason why I left the ministry was because my party and my prime minister capitulated to the loan agreement. But immediately after that capitulation, that's what usually happens. If you capitulate on one big thing, then you capitulate on everything. After that, he also capitulated and signed the European Union Treaty with Turkey, which is an affront to civilization. Because what we're doing is we're effectively, the West, civilized Europe, we are bribing an increasingly dictatorial president of Turkey to the tune of something like $7 billion, so that he allows us to violate international law on refugees. According to international law of refugees, people coming to your country have the right, by international law, to a hearing that will determine whether they are political refugees or not. They don't have that right on Lesbos. Because the EU-Turkey treaty has deemed that Turkey is a safe country, so that when you arrive on Lesbos, you are not granted an interview as to whether you've been persecuted by the Syrian regime, by the Taliban, by I don't know whom. And you are kept there for an indefinite period. You are not allowed to go to the rest of Greece. You can wander around like a lost soul in Lesbos. But of course you live in the camp because there's nowhere else to live. Well, where are you going to live? On the beach? So it's purely horrible. But let's just take a broader look at that situation. You said the immigration problem. I don't see why immigration is a problem. I think that immigration is a great asset. From a European perspective, for 1,000 years, we have been populating the earth, we Europeans. We've been sending our ships and our caravans to the Americas, to Australia, to New Zealand. We destroyed all the indigenous people in the world. In Africa, we colonized. Okay, we created the new world. That's what we did. And we thought it was all right. Now what's happening is we are aging. We're becoming a sad, aged lot. Yeah? And the demographic dynamics are reversing. And and we need these people. We really need these people. Germany is being depleted. It's becoming another Japan. Greece, too. We have an economic crisis as well. We are in a process of desertification. So we need these people. Instead of treating immigration, as an asset that we must collectively manage and find ways of making it work for us, Europeans, we are looking at it as a threat, and we are trying to imagine a huge wall, Trump-like, going through the Mediterranean, the North Pole. I don't know what they're going to do. It's pathetic. It's just a complete failure of the imagination. It's misanthropy. And the result, of course, is that the taller and more impenetrable the wall that we create, the only thing that changes is more deaths and greater profits for the traffickers. It doesn't stop immigration. All it does, it creates insecurity, both in the local population and in the migrant population, and profits for the traffickers. So, let them in and impose minimum wages, living wages, in the countries of their origin. And if the countries cannot provide them, help them provide them. That's the solution, not walls.
Hi. I can't help but notice that we're talking about the continuum of capitalism while we overlook a graveyard. My understanding, which might be wrong, is that we're paying approximately $8 trillion for the wars in interest.
For the wars?
For the wars, U.S.
Yeah.
How does an economy overcome that? I mean, and how does that play out? $8 trillion in interest per year, if that's...
No, it's not 8 trillion per year.
It's not?
No.
Okay.
No. No. But what is your general concern? That we pay too much for what? For the debt?
No, I'm talking about the wars, just the wars.
Yeah.
All right, let me change.
Maybe it's 8 billion, but not 8 trillion.
Okay, then my figures are wrong.
3 zeros is okay.
Okay.
Well, look, the United States of America, as Eisenhower told you in the 1950s and warned you, is predicated upon but a very interesting industrial policy. You don't have a formal industrial policy, you have something called the military-industrial complex. And the military-industrial complex is essential for American capitalism in the way that the American capitalism has been created. So the reason why Missouri and Massachusetts can be in the same union and you don't have the same problems that we have between Greece and Germany is because you have what I call a surplus recycling mechanism. You have food stamps, you have social security, and that means that money that is taxed in the surplus states is transferred to the deficit states, and that keeps a degree of balance. But the most important part of your surplus recycling mechanism is a military-industrial complex. So when Boeing gets a contract to build the new generation of fighter jets, quadrillions, yeah? The Pentagon says to them, yeah, but you're going to have to build the engine in a new site in Missouri, in the deficit places, you know, the plane, the spare parts of this and that over there, and so on. So to keep this going, you need some wars. I'm not proposing that this is how it should be. I'm just describing it. So in 1991, the Pentagon and the Treasury Department in this country had a major headache. The Cold War had finished. So they could no longer pass through Congress on the basis of national security the bills that were necessary in order to keep replenishing the cruise and Pershing missiles. So they had to clear the stock. So you had the first war in Iraq. And they cleared, remember the war had finished, and they were going into the middle of the desert and firing all the cruise and Pershing missiles to get rid of them so that they could order new ones in order to maintain. So capitalism is just a very rational system because it's a very simple reason why it's so irrational, because it has a productive capacity, a capacity to produce, which far exceeds its capacity to consume. So something has to make up this difference. And war is the result, not just lack of democracy.
Hi, thank you for tonight. Question for you. If we, theoretically, go back to 2015, you're now in charge instead of Tsipras, in charge of Greece. Faced with harsh austerity versus Grexit, what political path would you have chosen?
Well, you know the answer. That's why I'm here. I'm not in the ministry. Why am I not in the ministry? No. Why did I resign? Because we had an agreement. We had a very simple agreement. And this is the only reason why I accepted the finance ministry and to run in the election. We had an agreement that there were 3 possible outcomes. I'll put it succinctly. 3 possible outcomes. One was continuing debt bondage in the euro, which is what has been happening since 2010. For me, that was the worst possible outcome. Another outcome was Grexit, for Greece to be chucked out of the Eurozone or to choose to get out. This came with substantial costs, and it was never my proposal. But I always considered it to be better than perpetual debt bondage in the euro. When people say, but the euro is a strong currency, I say, yeah, well, if you're a pauper and you live under a bridge in New York, you have $1 in your pocket, it doesn't mean you have a strong currency. You have one bloody dollar in your pocket, yeah? It doesn't help much. And then the first best, my ideal solution would be debt restructuring within the euro that would allow us to stay in the euro in a sustainable way and to end the Great Depression. So the point I was making was, no bluffing. We say to them, we don't want to get out of the euro, but we need a debt restructure and we need the end of austerity for Greece to remain sustainable within the euro. And that's what we want. And let's sit down and we will compromise. I did say to Obama when he said, but Yanis, you have to compromise. I compromised. I said, I dream of compromise. But I'm never going to be compromised. There's a fundamental difference between the two. Okay? And we say to them that we are not going to accept that we are not putting our signature on another loan agreement that extends and pretends our bankruptcy into the future. So shoot us, kill us, get us out of the euro. We don't want to get out of the euro, but we consider getting out of the euro to be a lesser evil than staying under the conditions of debt. So Tsipras supposedly agreed with me, and not only agreed with me, but considered to be more right-wing than him, and more ready to compromise. And he had some reasons. I mean, not that he was right, but you'll be very interested to hear that one of the people that worked with me during this period in creating the plan and the narrative against the Troika and the International Monetary Fund was somebody called Larry Summers, who was actually very good, because he understood that what was happening in Greece reflected very quickly and immediately in the European macroeconomic stance, which was detrimental to the interests of the United States. So we worked together with Larry Summers, and when we met, I said, I'm very glad you haven't read my last book. And he said, why? I said, because I referred to it to you on a number of occasions in the same book as a Prince of Darkness. And he said, well, at least you called me Prince. I've been called worse. So it's clear. Yeah.
The two organizations I like to follow side by side, the DM25 movement and 6 Degrees of Citizen Space in Canada with John Ralston Saul. And I just really enjoyed John Ralston Saul's book, The Collapse of Globalism. And he describes this idea of a positive form of nationalism that we haven't explored. We think of nationalism as negative, and we often only see negative forms based on exclusion. But our movements like DM25, imagining and exploring, possibly hijacking and displacing hate with positive forms of nationalism that are centered around inclusion and sort of collective missions like reducing inequality that can capture a lot of the people that are displaced in this country, the Trump voters that might not be racist, that just wanted a better deal. And they really fall in with the flag. When someone waves the flag, they're easy to be manipulated. They just feel that they must go with it. But now in this country, when you see 2 American flags on the back of a pickup truck, that's kind of a hate symbol. The left, progressive people that enjoy inclusion have maybe allowed the flag to get stolen from them. But then at the same time, we need to integrate nationalism, possibly a new form, with ideas like a federation, to gain more power back into the political sphere against, the financial sphere.
Well, let me say that I get your drift. I grew up in a culture where the left answered this question of yours a long time ago by making a distinction not between positive and negative nationalism, but between nationalism and patriotism. Our line was always, we're patriots, and the difference between a patriot and a nationalist, the patriot loves his country, and the nationalist thinks that his country has the right to steamroll over every other country. And I think that is a good way of resolving it. And also, by making this more contemporary, I think we have to appropriate the slogan, I want my country back, I think we should take this and say, yes, I want my city back. I want my neighborhood back. I want control over my city, my municipality, my state, my country. But the only way to get my country back is if others get their countries back as well. And if we all work together and we understand that to get our countries back, we need to resolve problems such as low quality jobs, low levels of investment in the green transition that the planet needs, climate change and so on, that we need to fight poverty. And it is impossible to fight poverty in one country when it's rising in other countries. If you think that you can do that, you are deluding yourself. So in effect, to embed patriotism in a narrative which sees the major problems that society faces, like poverty, low investment, problems with the health service and so on, as we see climate change. What I mean by that is climate change requires local action, that we do things here in Boston, that we do things in Massachusetts, in the United States, but we have to act globally as well. And we need to cooperate. Because resolving poverty, as I said, can only happen at... the Bretton Woods system is a good example. Poverty fell everywhere throughout the global system of the Bretton Woods. Inequality shrunk everywhere. It couldn't rise in one place massively and fall in another. So we have to combine love of country, of neighborhood, of community, patriotism, with a transnationalism and internationalism that allows us to claim our own countries back.
A funny multinational question that I would love to hear answered from you. In the book, John Rousensall describes this concept where a lot of the trade that we have is fictitious. It is multinationals trading with themselves.
Yeah, of course.
And can you
it's called limit pricing.
Well, now, we were just creating these tariffs that might not really get to the root of the issue. We were punishing multinationals. We weren't punishing another nation. We were punishing multinationals that straddle two nations. And that not a lot of people in this country know how to think of these concepts and think of...
Well, I have a better way of punishing the multinationals. How about making the IRS do its job? Because if you go to Venezuela, bad example, if you go to Italy and make some money, you get taxed here. You are taxed by the IRS on your global income. You cannot say, I made $10,000 in Napoli, and therefore that's none of your business, taxman or woman. No, you get taxed on your global income in the United States, unless you're a corporation. And then you don't get taxed at all for the money you stash away all over the world. How about having the IRS do its job, instead of introducing tariffs that in the end have a detrimental effect on all of us?
The IRS can't
Yes, it can.
That.
Yes, of course
they
it can.
Invent the
of course you can.
Themselves?
No. They need their marching orders from Congress. They need the politicians to say to them, you're going to treat... Look, the Supreme Court, in its infinite idiocy, decided that corporations and and individuals will be treated the same when it comes to super PACs and all that, right?
Yeah.
Well, why not also decide that corporations and individuals will be treated the same tax-wise?
Okay,
I remember a beautiful poster I saw in Texas saying that...
I like it.
No, okay.
We're going to take the last question.
I believe that corporations have human rights when I see one of them being hanged.
Yeah.
That was Texas for you.
Yeah. In the briefest and broadest of strokes, in the post-capitalistic world that you envision, what does the credit system look like, and how does it achieve equilibrium with the sovereignty of states?
Okay, how long do we have? No, but let me put it simply. If we have a system where private property is maintained over goods and services and things that give you happiness, but not over productive processes, and productive processes belong to those that work them, that are part of it, then you simply do not have a credit system. You don't need one at all.
And your justification for that is?
That credit is only necessary when you've got an asymmetrical distribution of property rights over means of production.
So you wouldn't say...
If you and I have a cooperative, if you and I have a
cycles?
cooperative, if we own a business together, we have a partnership, then I'm never going to be in your debt or you in my debt. We're going to be producing together, and we're going to be sharing the profits that we make, the economic rents.
What about investors?
Well, there will be no investors.
What about the other parts?
Because investors exist only because you have an asymmetrical distribution of wealth.
And so back
if you didn't have asymmetrical distribution, but look, this is going to be the topic of my next book. I have not written it yet. So I'll see you in 2 years.